At a family gathering, my late wife's sister slapped me right in front of my kids. She yelled that I was not even a real father and that I had just adopted them. I touched my stinging cheek, smiled, and calmly told her that since she brought it up, we could finally end the charade. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled relatives who severely underestimated your strength. My name is Willis. I am 70 years old, an African-American man who pulled himself out of the darkest corners of poverty to build a sprawling corporate real estate empire. Tonight was supposed to be a quiet, dignified evening of remembrance. We were hosting a private memorial dinner at my estate to mark exactly 1 year since the passing of my beloved wife, Evelyn. The atmosphere in the grand dining room was already suffocating, weighed down by the greedy impatience of my family, when the heavy mahogany doors swung open violently. Valerie stood in the entryway. She was Evelyn's estranged sister, a toxic woman who had vanished 35 years ago without a single trace or goodbye. Now she stood in my home, reeking of cheap gin and stale smoke, swaying unsteadily on her heels. She marched straight to the head of the table, interrupting the solemn dinner, and demanded immediate control of the family trust fund. She claimed it was her biological right to claim what Evelyn left behind. I remained seated, staring at this aggressive ghost from the past, and flatly refused her absurd demand. I told her she had zero legal or moral authority in my house. Valerie slammed her hands on the polished dining table, violently rattling the crystal glasses and spilling red wine across the white linen tablecloth. She leaned in dangerously close, her breath foul with alcohol, and screamed that she was the true blood of this family. Then, with a sudden erratic swing, she struck me across the face. The slap echoed through the massive dining room like a gunshot. She yelled that I was not even a real father, that I just adopted them, and that I meant absolutely nothing to her bloodline. I sat perfectly still as the silence in the room became absolute. I looked at the people I had spent decades providing for, expecting a single voice to rise in my defense. Kendall, my son, nervously adjusted his expensive silk tie and stared down at the Persian rug, entirely unwilling to meet my gaze or intervene. Jasmine, my daughter, did not even flinch at the violence. She simply picked up her smartphone and began scrolling through her messages, acting as though a physical assault on her father was merely an annoying interruption to her evening. Bradley, her white husband, who paraded around town playing the role of a hotshot investor, stood by the fireplace. He deliberately swirled the expensive wine in his glass and offered me a highly condescending smirk. Not one of them condemned the violence. Not one of them defended the man who gave them everything. I slowly raised my hand and touched my burning cheek. I looked directly into Valerie's bloodshot eyes. I smiled a cold and hollow expression and told her that since she brought the matter of bloodlines to the table, we would proceed exactly on those terms. I pushed my chair back and stood up, towering over the room. As I turned my back on the silent dining room, my mind replayed a harrowing night from 35 years ago. It was a freezing December evening when Evelyn and I kicked down the door of a squalid, unheated motel room on the absolute worst side of town. We found two terrified toddlers, Kendall and Jasmine, huddled together on a filthy mattress, surrounded by empty liquor bottles and dirty drug needles. Valerie had abandoned them there to chase her next high. She walked away without looking back, leaving her own flesh and blood to freeze or starve to death. I was a man who had fought tooth and nail against a world designed to keep me at the bottom. I built my construction and real estate empire from a single rusty pickup truck and a shovel, enduring relentless prejudice and hardship. I knew the brutal reality of the streets, and I swore no child in my care would ever feel that kind of despair. Evelyn and I legally adopted them. We gave them our name, our unwavering love, and a life of absolute privilege. We shielded them from the ugly truth of their biological mother. We paid for elite private schools, luxury vehicles, and massive cash down payments on their penthouses. We gave them a pristine, flawless world. They repaid that decades-long devotion by treating me like a disposable bank account, waiting patiently for my demise while embracing the very woman who had left them for dead. My silence as I walked down the long hallway was not a sign of defeat. It was the total evaporation of my parental mercy. The emotional cord snapped cleanly, leaving nothing behind but cold calculation and a promise of justice. I walked into my private study and closed the heavy oak doors, securely locking out the noise of the traders lingering in my dining room. The space was completely soundproof, lined with leather-bound books and the architectural blueprints of the empire I had built with my own bare hands. I walked over to my polished mahogany desk, picked up the secure landline, and dialed the direct emergency number for my primary wealth management team. The chief financial officer answered on the second ring, recognizing my private extension. I did not waste time with pleasantries or lengthy explanations about the evening's disaster. I issued a single emotionless order. I instructed him to instantly freeze every secondary platinum credit card attached to my personal and business accounts. I then ordered the immediate, unappealable suspension of the massive commercial credit lines operating under my guarantor signature. These were the exact credit lines that Kendall and Bradley relied on daily to fund their extravagant lifestyles and prop up their failing investment ventures. I wanted every financial artery severed without a single warning or notification. The officer confirmed the orders, immediately processing the digital blocks while I remained on the line to ensure total compliance. I knew the massive financial shockwave would hit them violently before the sun even came up. They had grown incredibly comfortable believing my wealth was their permanent, unconditional safety net. They believed my parental love made me weak and entirely blind to their disrespect. I placed the phone back on the receiver and stood by the large bay window looking out over the manicured grounds of my estate. They wanted to claim their independence and celebrate their biological roots. I was simply granting their wish by removing the invisible financial shield that had protected them from the real world. The silent correction had officially begun. 12 hours later, the shockwave of my single phone call hit its first target with devastating precision. Bradley stood in the center of an immaculate showroom at a high-end European auto dealership across town. He was loudly negotiating the final upgrades on a customized matte black Porsche, wearing his arrogance like a tailored suit. He boasted to the young salesman about his latest venture capital acquisitions, playing the role of the invincible financial titan. When the finance manager presented the payment terminal, Bradley slid his platinum card into the slot with the casual flick of a man who believed his wealth was infinite. The machine beeped a sharp, undeniable denial. Bradley chuckled, blaming a bank error, and confidently handed over a second card. Declined. He gritted his teeth and produced a third. Declined. The respectful smiles of the dealership staff hardened into masks of professional pity. Other wealthy patrons turned their heads, their hushed whispers amplifying the total public embarrassment. The manager politely informed Bradley that the primary account holder had permanently revoked all authorization and flagged the cards for immediate confiscation. Bradley snatched his worthless plastic back, his face burning a deep, blotchy red. He stormed out of the showroom, leaving behind the echo of his shattered ego. His facade of the self-made financial prodigy dissolved instantly when the invisible umbilical cord to my bank account was cut. He was nothing but a hollow man pretending to be a king. At that exact moment on the other side of the city, a digital notification flashed across Kendall's phone. It was an urgent automated alert from the central bank. The massive mortgage payment for his sprawling downtown penthouse had bounced due to insufficient funds, triggering an immediate default status. Panic is a highly contagious disease among those who refuse to work for their keep. Within an hour, tires screeched violently against the gravel driveway of my estate. Bradley and Kendall had mobilized, dragging Valerie along with them like a venomous mascot. They bypassed the intercom and marched directly to the heavy oak front doors, pounding their fists against the polished wood. They screamed my name, their voices a chaotic blend of unearned entitlement and raw terror. Kendall kicked the heavy brass knocker, demanding that I fix the sudden block on his accounts before his life fell apart. Bradley yelled legal threats, claiming my actions were a breach of contract and demanding the immediate reinstatement of his commercial credit lines. Their frantic shouting shattered the morning peace of the neighborhood. They sounded exactly like spoiled children throwing a tantrum in a toy store, completely oblivious to the fact that the man who owned the store had just locked the doors and turned off the lights. They demanded answers, entirely unprepared for the harsh reality I was about to deliver. I did not hide behind the heavy oak doors. I turned the brass knob and stepped out onto the expansive wraparound porch. I held a mug of steaming black coffee, taking a slow sip as I watched them pant and seethe at the bottom of the concrete steps. Bradley pointed a shaking finger at me, demanding to know by what right I was ruining his business. I looked down at him and spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity. I explained that his entire investment firm was nothing more than a fragile house of cards propped up solely by my guarantor's signature. I built my empire hauling concrete, laying bricks, and negotiating cutthroat land deals while facing down bankers who refused to look an African-American man in the eye. I know what real capital looks like, and I know what a parasite looks like. Bradley's company produced zero actual profit. He merely shuffled my money around to pay for luxury office leases, country club memberships, and fake dividends to maintain his illusion of success. The moment I removed my financial backing, his corporate shell collapsed under its own weight. I looked at Kendall, shaking my head at his absolute lack of backbone. I told them both that the free ride ended the exact second Valerie's hand struck my face last night. The father they openly dismissed had just officially resigned from his post as their permanent safety net. The frantic, chaotic energy in the courtyard suddenly shifted. Bradley stopped yelling in mid-sentence. He lowered his shaking hand and ran it through his hair, taking a deep, stabilizing breath. The panic drained from his face, quickly replaced by a slow, highly predatory grin that stretched across his features. He stepped forward, brushing past a highly confused Kendall, and planted his feet firmly at the base of the porch steps. He declared in a smooth, arrogant tone that my little financial blockade did not matter anymore. He stated loudly that they no longer needed my money, my credit lines, or my pathetic charity. Reaching into the inner pocket of his designer jacket, Bradley pulled out a thick, legally bound document stamped with an official golden seal. He held it high into the morning light for me to see. He announced that he was holding a newly discovered legally binding modification to my late wife's final testament. According to Bradley, Evelyn had signed this exact document on her deathbed, explicitly revoking my control over the family trust. The modified will supposedly transferred the entire estate, including the very property I was currently standing on, directly to her biological sister, Valerie. The triumphant sneer on Bradley's face was meant to serve as a death blow to my authority, shifting the battlefield from my bank accounts directly into the courtroom. I did not waste a single second responding to Bradley's triumphant sneer. I turned my back on the three of them, standing on my porch, walked directly to my garage, and started the engine of my car. Within 40 minutes, I was sitting in the high-rise downtown office of Jonathan Pierce, my most trusted corporate attorney, and a man who had navigated the legal minefields of my empire for 2 decades. I tossed the thick, legally bound document onto his polished glass desk. Bradley had foolishly handed over a physical copy of his supposed triumph, completely underestimating my absolute refusal to back down. Jonathan adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and placed the contested document directly under the harsh, unforgiving glare of a specialized halogen desk lamp. He retrieved a magnifying loupe from his top drawer and studied the signature block in utter silence. The strokes forming Evelyn's name were undeniably accurate, capturing the exact, elegant loops she had used throughout her entire life. However, Jonathan immediately pointed out a fatal flaw in the fabrication. He tapped his heavy gold pen against the paper, explaining that the pen pressure was entirely unnatural. The ink distribution showed a slow, highly calculated tracing method rather than the fluid, confident sweep of a natural signature. Someone had spent hours meticulously forging my late wife's handwriting, pressing down far too heavily at the pivot points of each letter. The document was a masterclass in visual deception, but it lacked the organic rhythm of a living human hand. Jonathan looked up at me, his brow furrowed with deep concern, warning me that proving forgery in family court could become a drawn-out, highly contested legal nightmare. He cautioned that a judge might still accept it if a notary had sworn to witnessing the signature in person. I simply shook my head and shut down his legal hesitation with a single, undeniable medical fact. I told Jonathan that we would not need a handwriting expert to tear this fabricated document to shreds in a courtroom. I pointed directly at the date stamped at the top of the testament, which claimed the document was executed a mere 3 days before Evelyn passed away. I leaned over his desk and informed him that my beautiful wife spent the last 2 solid weeks of her life locked in a deep, medically induced coma at the intensive care unit. Her body had been entirely reliant on a ventilator, her hands completely immobilized by intravenous lines and heart monitors. Signing a complex legal document of this magnitude, let alone gripping a pen or acknowledging a notary, was biologically impossible. The realization struck Jonathan instantly. The memory of those final 2 weeks remains the darkest chapter of my entire existence. I had sat beside her hospital bed every single hour, holding her fragile hand, knowing that the woman who had stood by my side while I built my construction business from the mud was slowly slipping away. Kendall and Jasmine rarely visited her during that time, always citing busy schedules or minor inconveniences, while their mother fought for her last breaths. Bradley had never once stepped foot in that hospital room. They did not know the exact timeline of her medical decline, and their sheer arrogance had blinded them to the necessity of checking the hospital records before manufacturing their little masterpiece. Their greed had caused them to make a catastrophic chronological error, cementing their own legal destruction. They had handed me the exact rope needed to hang them in front of a judge. With the biological impossibility of the signature firmly established, Jonathan shifted his absolute focus to the embossed golden seal, validating the fake will. A document of this scale required the official stamp of a licensed notary public to carry any weight in probate court. Jonathan dragged the heavy paper closer to the light and scrutinized the small circular indentation pressed into the bottom corner. He read the credentials aloud, his tone dripping with immediate suspicion. The seal belonged to an obscure, practically unknown law practice situated in a neglected, dilapidated suburban district located 40 miles outside the city limits. It was a massive red flag. A woman of Evelyn's immense wealth and high social standing would never bypass our prestigious downtown legal team to finalize her last will and testament in a rundown strip mall office. I instructed Jonathan to dig directly into the origins of this mysterious notary. We needed to understand exactly how Bradley had managed to secure an official state seal to legitimize a document signed by a comatose woman. Jonathan turned to his dual computer monitors, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the state's registry of licensed legal professionals. He bypassed the public directories and logged straight into a comprehensive background check database reserved for high-tier corporate investigations. We were hunting for the specific connection between a supposedly legitimate public servant and the desperate, greedy son-in-law who had just tried to steal my entire estate. The digital search yielded results in a matter of seconds, populating the screen with public records, business associations, and family lineage connected to the specific license number stamped on the fraudulent will. Every single detail began to paint a very clear picture of desperation. The search results illuminated the dark room, displaying the face of the notary public whose signature validated the fake will. The name on the screen belonged to a man named Arthur, a low-level legal clerk with a history of minor professional infractions. Jonathan rapidly pulled up the man's familial connections, cross-referencing his residential history and immediate relatives. The data loaded instantly, and a cold, grim satisfaction settled over me. The screen revealed that Arthur was not just a random corrupt official looking to make a quick bribe. He was Bradley's biological cousin on his mother's side. My arrogant son-in-law had kept the illegal operation entirely within his own white family, relying on blood ties to secure a fraudulent state seal. Bradley believed he was an untouchable mastermind, assuming that his sophisticated corporate facade would shield him from any real scrutiny. He thought he could manipulate the legal system by using a desperate relative to bypass the standard authentication protocols. By doing so, he had officially escalated his actions from a petty family dispute into a massive federal crime. Falsifying a legal document to steal a multi-million-dollar estate paired with notary fraud carried a severe mandatory prison sentence. He had handed me the absolute perfect weapon to dismantle his entire life. Jonathan looked at me, completely astounded by the sheer stupidity of their conspiracy. He reached for his desk phone, asking if we should contact the district attorney right now. I placed my hand firmly over his phone and told him to stop. I did not want to strike just yet. If Bradley was brazen enough to forge a will, he was undoubtedly hiding far more sinister financial crimes inside his own company. Jonathan reached across his polished glass desk for the telephone, his fingers hovering over the receiver, fully prepared to bring the absolute weight of the district attorney down upon my arrogant son-in-law. I reached out and firmly clamped my hand over his wrist, forcing the heavy plastic receiver back into its cradle. Calling the police at this exact second was the predictable move, the standard reaction of an ordinary man blinded by sudden anger. I was not an ordinary man. If Bradley possessed the sheer audacity to forge a legal testament using his own blood relative as a fake notary, he was operating from a place of complete, unrestrained panic. Desperation in a man who handled millions of dollars daily meant his corporate facade was actively crumbling from the inside out. I looked Jonathan dead in the eye and instructed him to mobilize his elite team of private forensic accountants immediately. I did not want local police stumbling clumsily through Bradley's files and freezing the board before I could see the full picture. I needed a surgical strike into the very heart of his investment firm. I commanded Jonathan to authorize a shadow audit bypassing standard legal discovery to quietly rip open Bradley's digital ledgers. I wanted to trace every single cent moving through that firm, specifically looking for the exact origin of his current panic. Jonathan understood instantly, his sharp legal mind shifting from prosecution to corporate espionage. He locked the forged will inside his heavy steel safe and picked up his secured mobile phone to assemble the audit team. I sat back in the leather chair watching the city skyline through the office window. Bradley believed he was playing a game of intimidation against a tired old man. He had no idea he had just invited a seasoned predator directly into his fragile financial ecosystem. The forensic accounting team did not disappoint my expectations. Within 48 hours, they completely breached the heavily encrypted digital ledgers of Bradley's supposedly elite investment firm. The preliminary report Jonathan placed on my desk was a masterclass in catastrophic corporate failure. The numbers stared back at me, telling a brutal, undeniable story of massive financial rot. Bradley was not a brilliant venture capitalist. He was a reckless gambler operating a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. The internal ledgers revealed that he had been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from his primary client trust accounts. He was desperately moving stolen money through a complex maze of dummy corporations to cover massive, undisclosed personal debts. He had leveraged his pristine reputation, a reputation bought entirely with my initial capital, to secure high-risk loans that had completely collapsed. The audit exposed a man drowning in a sea of red ink, frantically shifting funds from one account to another just to keep the lights on and the angry creditors at bay. His tailored suits, his luxury vehicles, and his arrogant sneer were all financed by stolen money. The sheer scale of the embezzlement was staggering, highlighting a profound lack of basic financial discipline. Every time the market dipped, Bradley stole more client funds to cover his mounting losses. He was legally cornered, morally bankrupt, and entirely dependent on the continuous flow of fresh capital to avoid a massive federal indictment. This immense, crushing pressure explained his frantic urgency to claim my estate. He did not just want to live comfortably on my wealth. He absolutely needed the immediate liquidation of my properties to fill the gaping multi-million-dollar hole in his corporate accounts before the federal regulators caught wind of his spectacular implosion. I looked at the damning spreadsheets, feeling a cold wave of clarity wash over me. I recognized this exact breed of financial panic. Decades ago, long before the tailored suits and the sprawling, secure estate, I was just a kid scraping a living from the brutal, unforgiving concrete of the inner city. I built my empire hauling heavy bricks, surviving in harsh environments where desperate men would kill over a few stolen dollars. I know the distinct metallic stench of desperate money. It is a foul scent that makes people abandon all logic and commit wildly reckless acts. That same unhinged desperation was exactly what drove Valerie to abandon her young children in that squalid motel 35 years ago. She chased her addiction until it hollowed out her soul and stripped her of all maternal instinct. Now, looking at Bradley's ruined ledgers, the scattered pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. Valerie did not suddenly reappear at my estate out of a dormant sense of family obligation. A toxic woman like her does not cross state lines simply to attend a memorial dinner for the sister she openly despised. She came back because she smelled blood in the water. Valerie had somehow uncovered Bradley's massive corporate theft. She recognized a weak, cornered animal and decided to bleed him dry. Her drunken, aggressive demand for the family trust fund in my dining room was just a theatrical distraction. The real play was relentless extortion. She was holding the threat of federal exposure over Bradley's head, forcing him to manufacture the fake will to secure the funds she demanded. The two parasites had found each other locked in a toxic dance of blackmail and forgery, completely oblivious to the fact that I was actively pulling the strings. The revelation of Valerie's extortion plot was entirely logical, fitting her destructive character perfectly. However, the final page of the forensic audit contained a detail that instantly turned the blood in my veins to ice. I had instructed the accounting team to track the exact destination of the hush money Bradley was desperately bleeding from his firm. I fully expected to find a hidden domestic account registered to Valerie, perhaps a quiet wire transfer to a post office box, operating under a fake alias. The expert auditors traced a series of highly sophisticated, encrypted wire transfers explicitly designed to evade federal banking oversight. The stolen money was moving offshore, funneling rapidly into a secure shell account located in the Cayman Islands. Jonathan pointed a shaking finger at the final printed routing document on his desk. His voice dropped to a heavy, stunned whisper as he revealed the ultimate beneficiary of the offshore account. The funds were not going to Valerie. The international shell company was registered directly under the maiden name of my adopted daughter, Jasmine. My mind raced as the sheer terrifying magnitude of the betrayal expanded before my eyes. Jasmine was not a passive victim of her husband's crumbling business or a helpless bystander to her biological mother's sudden return. She was the absolute mastermind. She was actively orchestrating the extortion of her own husband, funneling the stolen client funds into her private overseas vault. The very daughter I had rescued from a dirty mattress and provided with a life of absolute luxury was using her biological mother as a terrifying proxy to bleed Bradley dry. The deception ran far deeper than a simple forged will intertwining every single member of my so-called family in a massive cutthroat criminal conspiracy. Willis received a formal invitation to his absolute favorite dining establishment in the city. The text message from Jasmine claimed the family wanted to make amends and apologize for the terrible chaos of the past few days. Willis knew the apology was a complete fabrication, fully aware from the forensic audit that Jasmine was the actual mastermind funneling stolen money into offshore accounts. He accepted the invitation solely to observe their next desperate maneuver. He arrived precisely on time, dressed in a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, and the maitre d' guided him to a secluded private booth in the back of the restaurant. Valerie, Kendall, and Jasmine were already seated, projecting an aura of forced sophistication. Bradley was noticeably absent, likely hiding in shame or frantically trying to plug the bleeding holes in his destroyed firm. Valerie greeted Willis with a sickeningly sweet smile, acting as if she had not physically assaulted him or conspired to steal his entire empire. Kendall nervously adjusted his collar, refusing to make direct eye contact, while Jasmine attempted to play the role of the dutiful, loving daughter. The table was adorned with extravagant appetizers and a freshly opened bottle of imported vintage wine that cost more than most people earned in a month. They poured the dark red liquid into crystal glasses, raising them in a theatrical toast to family and forgiveness. The air in the private booth was thick with suffocating tension, every fake smile and forced laugh echoing hollowly against the velvet-lined walls. Willis sat perfectly straight in his chair, his hands resting calmly on the table. He did not touch the wine. He observed their desperate performance with the detached clinical fascination of a scientist examining a highly predictable toxic experiment. They were projecting wealth they no longer possessed. The superficial pleasantries expired almost immediately when the waiter cleared the appetizer plates. Valerie set her wine glass down and adopted a deeply patronizing tone, treating Willis like a fragile, confused patient. She reached into her designer handbag and produced a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy cardstock. She slid the papers across the polished mahogany table directly toward Willis. It was a comprehensive franchise transfer agreement drafted with aggressive ironclad clauses. Valerie framed the document as a generous truce, a guaranteed pathway to restoring peace within their fractured family. She explained the terms with absolute, unearned arrogance. If Willis signed the documents and voluntarily surrendered his controlling corporate shares, his full equity, and all real estate holdings to Bradley and Kendall, they would magnanimously assume the burden of running his vast empire. In exchange for surrendering his life's work, they promised to provide him with a modest fixed monthly stipend to cover his basic living expenses during his retirement. Jasmine chimed in, her voice dripping with fake concern, suggesting that the stress of managing such a massive portfolio was clearly taking a toll on his health. She claimed this arrangement would allow him to finally rest and enjoy his twilight years without any anxiety. Kendall nodded frantically in agreement, desperate to secure his unearned inheritance to save his own collapsing lifestyle. The sheer audacity of the proposition hung heavily in the air. They were essentially demanding that the king voluntarily hand over his crown and his kingdom in exchange for a meager peasant's allowance funded by his own stolen wealth. They honestly believed this pathetic, transparent manipulation would work. They assumed his quiet demeanor was a sign of ultimate surrender, rather than the methodical preparation of their absolute destruction. Willis did not even bother to pick up the document. He gazed at the towering stack of paper, then shifted his cold, unwavering stare to the three conspirators sitting across from him. He raised his right hand and silently flagged down the passing waiter. Reaching into his tailored jacket, Willis pulled out a worn leather wallet, the exact same wallet he had carried for over 20 years. He placed exact change on the table to cover the cost of his single glass of tap water, pointedly ignoring the astronomical bill they had racked up with their imported wine and imported delicacies. He looked directly at Valerie, and rejected her insulting offer with absolute surgical precision. He reminded them of a brutal reality they had conveniently chosen to forget. 40 years ago, he was pouring concrete in the blistering heat, sacrificing his body and his youth to build a solid foundation from nothing. He laid every brick of his empire while enduring systemic prejudice and financial starvation. He knew the grueling, agonizing cost of generating real, sustainable wealth. He pointed a steady finger at Kendall and Jasmine, entirely aware of her hidden offshore accounts, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He mocked their complete inability to create anything of value on their own. They were handed the keys to a kingdom they did not build, and they crashed it into a wall the moment they were required to steer. He told them they were fundamentally incapable of surviving the brutal realities of the corporate world without his protective shadow. They possessed no grit, no vision, and no genuine talent. They were merely parasites feeding off a host, and the host had permanently closed the buffet. Signing over his legacy to weak, ungrateful thieves was a biological and moral impossibility. The quiet, devastating truth of his words shattered the fragile illusion of their peaceful dinner. The polite, patronizing smile instantly vanished from Valerie's face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. Her hands clenched into tight fists, her knuckles turning white against the polished wood of the table. She realized that her manipulation tactics had failed completely, and that Willis saw right through her desperate extortion play. Jasmine and Kendall shrank back in their seats, terrified of the impending collision, but Valerie leaned aggressively across the table. Her eyes burned with a feral, chaotic desperation. She dropped the polite family facade and hissed a vicious, calculated threat directly into his face. She warned him that if he refused to sign the transfer agreement and walked out of the restaurant doors, tonight she would initiate her backup plan immediately. She declared her intention to contact Adult Protective Services first thing in the morning. She claimed she had already begun compiling a fraudulent narrative with corrupt medical professionals to declare him severely demented, aggressively paranoid, and a physical danger to himself and others. She threatened to drag his pristine reputation through the mud, to have the state seize control of his assets, and to lock him away in a sterile, heavily medicated facility for the rest of his natural life. She believed this ultimate threat of losing his freedom and his dignity would force his hand. She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile, fully convinced she had backed the old lion into an inescapable corner. Willis listened to the entirety of her vile ultimatum, without blinking, entirely unbothered by her pathetic attempt at psychological warfare. He calmly stood up, adjusted his charcoal jacket, and walked out the door. The sharp, authoritative rapping of heavy knuckles against the front door shattered the pristine silence of the early morning. Willis stood in the grand foyer, tying the belt of his silk robe, fully anticipating the arrival of Valerie's promised retaliation. When he opened the heavy oak door, he was greeted by the crisp morning air and the severe, unsmiling faces of an Adult Protective Services social worker, flanked closely by two uniformed police officers. Their physical posture communicated immediate caution, their hands resting near their utility belts as they prepared to encounter a volatile, unpredictable senior citizen. The social worker stepped forward, introducing herself with practiced, sterile professionalism, and held up a thick yellow medical file. She stated that they had received an urgent, legally mandated psychiatric intervention request regarding his immediate safety. Willis did not need to ask who had filed the paperwork. The social worker explained that the documents formally submitted just hours ago by his son-in-law Bradley detailed a harrowing narrative of severe cognitive decline, violent paranoia, and an absolute inability to manage his own physical and financial well-being. Bradley had flawlessly executed Valerie's malicious threat, utilizing his remaining corporate connections to secure an expedited emergency evaluation order. The file contained fabricated accounts of Willis wandering the estate at night, aggressively terminating his family's credit lines out of sheer delusional malice and expressing terrifying paranoid ideations. The officers kept their eyes locked on Willis, carefully assessing his stance and his facial expressions for any sign of the aggressive dementia described in the report. They expected an unhinged, shouting man incapable of logical reasoning. Instead, Willis looked at the thick yellow folder, offered the trio a highly polite, entirely composed nod, and smoothly stepped aside to invite them into his home. Willis did not raise his voice, nor did he display a single ounce of the frantic defensiveness that typically accompanies a false psychiatric accusation. He played the role of the ultimate gracious host, guiding the tense social worker and the watchful police officers through the expansive, sunlit corridors of his estate directly toward the kitchen. He poured 3 cups of premium black coffee, moving with steady, deliberate hands that showed absolutely zero tremors or hesitation. Handing the warm porcelain mugs to the officers, he calmly requested that they follow him into his private soundproof study to discuss the allegations properly. When he pushed open the mahogany doors, the authorities stepped into a room that immediately contradicted every single claim written in Bradley's fraudulent file. The massive wooden desk dominating the center of the room was completely covered in highly complex financial models, intricate tax projection spreadsheets, and dense legal corporate restructuring documents. Willis pointed to the meticulously organized paperwork explaining with clinical razor-sharp precision that he had finalized these exact portfolio assessments at 4 o'clock that very morning. He broke down the advanced fiscal mathematics tracking offshore wire transfers and detailed the specific yield curves of his diverse real estate holdings. He spoke with the commanding authoritative cadence of a seasoned chief executive officer leading a high-stakes board meeting. The social worker's professional mask began to slip, her eyes darting between the highly sophisticated financial models and the heavy medical file resting under her arm. The narrative of a confused, failing mind wandering aimlessly through a massive house evaporated instantly in the face of Willis's undeniable intellectual dominance. The officers relaxed their rigid postures, exchanging slightly embarrassed glances as they realized they were not dealing with a medical emergency but rather a brilliant man actively managing a vast empire. To entirely eradicate any lingering bureaucratic doubt, Willis picked up his desk phone and placed a single brief call to his private concierge physician. Dr. Arrington arrived at the estate in under 20 minutes carrying his black medical bag and an expression of utter disbelief regarding the APS intervention. Dr. Arrington was not just a hired professional, he was a fiercely loyal ally who knew the intricate history of the family. He had stood by Willis's side during the grueling final weeks of Evelyn's coma, intimately aware of the exact emotional and financial vultures circling the estate. Understanding the severe legal implications of Bradley's fabricated report, the doctor immediately commenced a rigorous, exhaustive cognitive and neurological examination right there in the study, using the 2 police officers as official impartial witnesses. He ran Willis through complex memory retention sequences, demanding the immediate recall of highly specific dates, obscure historical facts, and convoluted mathematical equations. Willis executed every single test flawlessly, his mind operating with the sharp, unyielding efficiency of a steel trap. He navigated the spatial awareness exams and logical reasoning puzzles with remarkable speed, answering with a calm, unwavering confidence that left the authorities completely astounded. The social worker watched in total silence, her pen hovering over her clipboard as she realized she had been weaponized in a vicious family dispute. Dr. Arrington concluded the examination by formally declaring Willis to be in the top 1% of cognitive functioning for his age bracket, utterly and entirely capable of managing his vast estate. The flawless execution of the medical exam did not just clear Willis of the false charges, it entirely dismantled the fraudulent accusations exposing Bradley's malicious report as a desperate, legally punishable act of extreme perjury. The profound embarrassment in the room was palpable as the social worker profusely apologized for the heavy-handed morning intrusion. She openly acknowledged the unfortunate reality that desperate family members frequently attempted to weaponize adult protective services to seize control of contested assets. As a formal gesture of bureaucratic transparency and professional courtesy, she handed Willis a redacted copy of the official medical complaint before she and the officers turned to leave the estate. Willis stood perfectly still in the quiet foyer, listening to the heavy front door click shut before he looked down at the physical evidence of Bradley's treachery. He bypassed the fabricated paragraphs detailing his supposed delusions and focused entirely on the official letterhead embossed at the top of the crisp white page. The psychiatric endorsement validating the emergency intervention did not belong to a highly respected downtown hospital or a reputable medical university. It belonged to the Oak Ridge Behavioral Center, a small, notorious private psychiatric clinic located on the very edge of the city limits. Willis possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the city's commercial real estate and business sectors. He knew exactly who owned that facility, and more importantly, he knew their precarious financial standing. The clinic had been actively teetering on the absolute brink of bankruptcy for the past 18 months, drowning in malpractice lawsuits and severe funding deficits. They were a desperate organization, facing total financial ruin. Willis tapped his finger against the embossed logo, a cold, understanding smile touching the corners of his mouth. A desperate clinic, urgently needing a massive influx of cash, had eagerly accepted a heavy, untraceable bribe from a desperate son-in-law needing a quick medical forgery. The perfect corrupt synergy had just handed Willis his next specific target. The drive to the Oak Ridge Behavioral Center took Willis and his private investigator to the absolute edge of the city where the pristine corporate high-rises dissolved into a bleak landscape of abandoned industrial lots and neglected strip malls. The clinic itself was a monument to institutional failure. The neon sign above the entrance flickered erratically, casting a sickly green glow over cracked pavement and an overflowing dumpster. Willis parked his understated sedan in the unlit alleyway adjacent to the staff exit, blending perfectly into the shadows. He did not intend to walk through the front doors and politely request a meeting with the administration. He operated by exploiting the undeniable vulnerabilities of desperate organizations. His investigator, a former federal agent named Vance, had spent the afternoon profiling the clinic's severely underpaid staff. Vance identified their primary target with surgical precision. She was a senior night shift nurse who had recently been denied a critical promotion and was drowning in student loan debt. They waited patiently in the damp, freezing alley until the nurse stepped out the back door for a scheduled cigarette break. She leaned against the graffitied brick wall, pulling her thin cardigan tight across her chest, her face illuminated by the harsh flare of her lighter. Her posture screamed exhaustion, resentment, and a profound hatred for her current employment. Willis recognized that exact look. It was the face of a person entirely ready to burn her bridges if someone offered her a viable escape route. He stepped out of the shadows and approached her with slow, deliberate steps, holding his hands open to signal he was not a physical threat. He introduced himself quietly and immediately presented her with an opportunity to walk away from this miserable job forever. The nurse initially stiffened, her eyes darting toward the security camera mounted above the steel door, but her defensive posture evaporated. The second Willis produced a thick, unsealed manila envelope from his tailored jacket. He did not waste her time with vague promises or moral pleas. He simply opened the flap and revealed thick stacks of crisp, untraceable $100 bills. He stated calmly that the envelope contained exactly enough capital to completely erase her crippling student debt and fund a very comfortable transition to a reputable hospital. In exchange for this immediate financial liberation, he required 10 minutes of completely unmonitored, unauthorized access to the clinic's internal security server. He assured her that his investigator would handle the technical extraction flawlessly, leaving absolutely no digital footprint that could trace the breach back to her credential logs. The nurse stared at the banded cash, the glowing cherry of her cigarette burning down to the filter. The sheer gravity of the bribe outweighed her meager professional loyalty to a clinic that actively exploited her. Without saying a single word, she dropped her cigarette, crushed it under the heel of her worn sneaker, and swiped her security badge against the restricted access panel. She led Willis and Vance through a dimly lit service corridor, bypassing the main reception desk entirely, and unlocked the door to the cramped, windowless server room. She logged into the primary terminal using a master administrative override password she had covertly acquired months ago. She stepped back, pointed at the glowing monitors, and told them they had exactly 15 minutes before the next scheduled guard patrol. Willis handed her the heavy envelope. She clutched the money to her chest, turned her back on her miserable career, and walked out the door. Vance immediately took control of the terminal, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, ruthless efficiency. He bypassed the clinic's outdated firewall in a matter of seconds, diving straight into the archived surveillance directories. Willis provided the exact timestamp from the fraudulent medical report handed to him by the social worker earlier that morning. Vance isolated the corresponding digital folder and pulled up the high-definition footage from a camera positioned in the administrative wing's secluded rear hallway. The grainy black-and-white video buffered for a brief moment before stabilizing into a crystal-clear image. The screen displayed Willis's son Kendall pacing nervously outside the chief psychiatrist's private office. Kendall's historic paralyzing cowardice made him the absolute perfect errand boy for Valerie's dirty work. As a child, whenever he broke a window or crashed a car, he would instantly construct elaborate, tearful lies to avoid the slightest reprimand, always seeking a stronger personality to hide behind. He possessed zero capacity for direct confrontation, preferring to slink through the shadows and execute the cowardly tasks required by more dominant predators. The office door opened, and the chief psychiatrist stepped into the dim corridor, glancing anxiously in both directions to ensure they were unobserved. Kendall immediately shoved a massive overstuffed envelope directly into the doctor's hands. The sheer bulk of the package clearly indicated a heavy cash bribe. The doctor greedily shoved the envelope inside his white medical coat and gestured for Kendall to step further into the shadows. Willis watched the digital betrayal unfold with cold, unblinking detachment. His own son was actively purchasing a fake dementia diagnosis to strip him of his fundamental human rights. The visual evidence was undeniable, securing the exact leverage required to annihilate the corrupt doctor's medical license permanently. Vance isolated the specific audio track attached to the hallway camera, activating a digital enhancement filter to strip away the background static of the clinic's ventilation system. The hidden microphone captured the illicit transaction with pristine, undeniable clarity. Kendall's voice echoed through the cramped server room, high-pitched and vibrating with absolute unadulterated panic. He aggressively complained to the doctor that he needed the official psychiatric declaration of dementia finalized and signed immediately, refusing to wait for the standard processing delays. The psychiatrist attempted to calm him down, citing necessary bureaucratic precautions, but Kendall lost total control of his fragile composure. He leaned into the doctor's face and explicitly stated that Valerie was not just demanding the family trust out of pure localized greed. He confessed, his voice trembling with genuine terror, that Valerie owed a massive, insurmountable financial debt to a highly violent international criminal syndicate. She had brought ruthless cartel enforcers directly into the city, and these men were actively hunting for Willis's liquid assets to balance her bloody ledgers. Kendall frantically explained that if they did not forcibly liquidate his father's sprawling estate within the week, the syndicate would start executing the family members one by one. The heavy revelation hit the server room like a physical shockwave. This was no longer a simple case of entitled heirs trying to accelerate their unearned inheritance through corporate forgery. This was an active, lethal threat to Willis's physical survival and the absolute destruction of his entire legacy. Valerie had dragged a pack of hungry wolves directly to his doorstep, using his children as desperate pawns. Willis ordered Vance to download the entire unedited file to a secure encrypted drive. The stakes had just escalated from legal retribution to an absolute war for survival. I sent a highly formal, digitally encrypted courier message directly to Kendall's personal phone, summoning him to the estate for a private dinner. The invitation contained no details, only a strict mandate regarding the time. Kendall arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, his forehead glistening with a heavy sheen of nervous sweat. He stepped into the grand dining room wearing a hastily pressed suit, practically vibrating with the desperate hope that this evening signaled a grand reconciliation. He believed the financial blockade and the brutal confrontation on the porch had finally broken my resolve, assuming I was ready to welcome him back into the fold of unconditional luxury. I did not offer a single word of greeting or comfort as he took his usual seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. I simply gestured for my private staff to serve the meal. We were presented with an immaculate cut of dry-aged steak, roasted root vegetables, and a carafe of iced water. I dismissed the staff for the remainder of the evening, ensuring we were entirely isolated. The atmosphere in the room immediately thickened into a suffocating, unbearable silence. I methodically cut my steak, the sharp scrape of the silver knife against the porcelain plate echoing like a judge's gavel in an empty courtroom. Kendall attempted to initiate conversation twice, clearing his dry throat and offering pathetic, halting pleasantries about the weather and the quality of the food. I refused to acknowledge him. I simply kept my eyes locked onto his trembling hands, watching his fragile confidence evaporate piece by piece with every agonizing minute of absolute, impenetrable silence. He chewed his food mechanically, swallowing hard, entirely unaware that he was participating in his own execution. When the plates were finally cleared, the heavy silence reached its absolute breaking point. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored jacket and produced a sleek black digital tablet. I placed the device squarely in the absolute center of the polished dining table and pushed it gently toward Kendall. His hands were shaking violently as he stared at the blank screen, entirely paralyzed by a sudden creeping terror. Without breaking direct eye contact, I reached forward and tapped the glowing play button. The crystal-clear audio of the Oak Ridge Behavioral Center's security footage instantly filled the cavernous dining room. The screen illuminated Kendall's panicked, sweating face as he stood in the dim hospital corridor, frantically shoving the overstuffed envelope of untraceable cash into the greedy hands of the corrupt chief psychiatrist. The video displayed every agonizing second of his ultimate betrayal in flawless high definition. Kendall's silver fork slipped from his trembling, clammy fingers, clattering loudly against the fine porcelain plate. Every single ounce of color drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale ash. His breathing turned shallow and erratic as he watched his own digital ghost actively purchase the fraudulent dementia diagnosis designed to destroy my entire life. He stared at the screen, utterly immobilized by the crushing weight of his exposed criminality. The undeniable visual evidence permanently dismantled his carefully constructed facade of the innocent, misunderstood son. He knew instantly that his fate was absolutely sealed. The severe federal charges of bribery, medical fraud, and elder abuse were no longer abstract concepts. They were physical realities playing on a continuous loop right in front of his terrified eyes. I sat back in my leather chair watching his soul collapse under the magnitude of his sins. Kendall violently pushed his heavy wooden chair back and collapsed directly onto the Persian rug. He fell heavily to his knees, crawling across the floor until he was practically begging at the tips of my polished shoes. He sobbed uncontrollably, gasping for air as he frantically pleaded with me to keep the digital footage hidden from the district attorney. He grabbed the fabric of my trousers, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine as he desperately weaponized the very childhood I had provided to him. He wailed about his deeply rooted insecurities, sobbing that he had spent his entire life feeling entirely inadequate, standing in the massive shadow of my immense corporate success. He claimed he never possessed my ruthless business acumen or my unwavering strength, always feeling like a hollow fraud wearing an expensive suit. He twisted his pathetic narrative, attempting to justify his monstrous betrayal by claiming he only wanted to finally impress Valerie. He stated that his biological mother was the only person who could validate his existence, and he was completely desperate to secure her maternal approval after 35 years of painful abandonment. He painted himself as a tragic, emotionally starved victim who merely followed orders to win the affection of a deeply broken woman. He sobbed that he never actually wanted to see me locked away in a psychiatric ward, insisting that he only intended to briefly paralyze my assets to appease her chaotic demands. He weaponized every ounce of pity he could muster, using his adopted status and his lifelong feelings of inferiority as a shield against the brutal reality of his actions. He begged for mercy, completely ignoring the fact that he had actively paid a corrupt doctor to permanently erase my fundamental human freedom. I looked down at the weeping, pathetic man groveling on my floor and felt absolutely zero mercy. I firmly removed his trembling hands from my clothing and demanded the unvarnished absolute truth. I told him his psychological excuses were utterly meaningless in the face of federal prison time and commanded him to explain the exact nature of Valerie's financial emergency. I stated clearly that if he lied to me for a single second, the security footage would be transmitted directly to the lead prosecutor within the hour. The terrifying finality in my voice broke the last remaining shards of his fragile composure. Kendall curled into a tight, trembling ball on the floor and confessed the ultimate horrifying reality of their conspiracy. He choked on his own tears as he revealed that Valerie did not simply owe a minor gambling debt or a standard loan to a local bank. She had actively stolen millions of dollars from a highly violent, incredibly ruthless international cartel syndicate operating just across the southern border. Her sudden aggressive reappearance in our lives was not a random coincidence. She had physically brought heavily armed cartel enforcers directly into the city limits to act as her lethal shadow. These highly trained killers were currently hunting the streets, actively searching for the massive liquid assets held within my corporate empire. Kendall confessed that Valerie had promised the syndicate full restitution by forcibly liquidating my sprawling estate using the forged medical documents. He wept as he admitted that the cartel had already issued a final, non-negotiable deadline. If they did not extract my wealth to satisfy Valerie's massive blood debt within the next 72 hours, the enforcers were ordered to begin systematically executing every single member of the family. The heavy, ornate grandfather clock in the central hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the vast, empty corridors of the estate. Willis remained seated in his darkened study, watching the glowing monitors of his newly upgraded security system. The digital perimeter map suddenly flashed a harsh, pulsing red along the southern boundary line. The advanced infrared sensors installed just days prior by his loyal security contractor detected a significant breach near the main wrought iron gates. Willis leaned forward, adjusting the camera feed to maximum resolution. A black, heavily tinted, unmarked pickup truck sat idling ominously just beyond the property line. The vehicle's headlights were extinguished, completely camouflaging it against the dense tree line. The engine let out a low, predatory rumble that vibrated through the crisp night air, captured perfectly by the exterior microphones. This was not a lost driver or a curious neighbor. This was a calculated display of intimidation, a physical manifestation of the terrifying international syndicate Kendall had tearfully confessed to hours earlier. Valerie had effectively painted a massive target on the estate, guiding ruthless enforcers directly to the epicenter of Willis's hard-earned empire. The truck sat motionless for exactly 5 minutes, an aggressive psychological tactic designed to inflict maximum terror upon anyone watching from inside. Willis did not flinch or reach for the panic button. He observed the vehicle with cold, calculating precision, analyzing the tactical positioning and the distinct lack of license plates. He knew the men inside were evaluating the physical defenses of the property, searching for the weakest point of entry. The electronic gates remained firmly locked, but the sheer presence of the cartel operatives signaled the absolute end of the invisible financial war. The conflict had officially escalated from corporate espionage to a direct physical siege. The heavy passenger doors of the idling pickup truck swung open simultaneously, disrupting the oppressive silence of the night. 2 imposing figures stepped out onto the damp asphalt, their physical features obscured by dark tactical clothing and pulled-down heavy hoods. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency that instantly separated them from common street criminals. These were professional enforcers, seasoned operators entirely accustomed to executing violent mandates without hesitation. They completely ignored the visible security cameras, projecting an aura of absolute invulnerability. One of the men retrieved a dense, heavy object from the bed of the truck, testing its weight in his gloved hands. He stepped aggressively toward the perimeter wall, pulling his arm back with practiced, lethal force. He hurled the object directly over the high brick barrier. A split second later, a deafening explosion of shattering glass violently ruptured the peace of the estate. The massive custom-built bay window in the formal living room completely disintegrated. A blinding shower of razor-sharp crystal rained down across the imported Persian rugs and the polished hardwood floors. The violent impact sent heavy shockwaves rattling through the antique furniture, knocking framed photographs off the mantelpiece. The 2 enforcers did not wait to observe the internal devastation. They immediately pivoted, climbed back into the black pickup truck, and aggressively accelerated down the winding residential road, their tires screeching against the pavement as they vanished into the darkness. Willis stepped out of his study and walked calmly toward the ruined living room. The cold night wind howled through the gaping hole in the architecture, rustling the heavy silk curtains. He stood amidst the glittering sea of broken glass, his eyes tracking the trajectory of the destruction to find the heavy masonry brick resting in the center of the room. Willis carefully navigated the treacherous floor, his leather shoes crushing shards of glass with every deliberate step. He reached down and retrieved the heavy concrete brick. A thick piece of coarse paper was bound tightly around the masonry using heavy industrial twine. He snapped the coarse string and unrolled the document under the dim light of a surviving table lamp. The note was not a lengthy, convoluted legal threat like the ones his greedy family members preferred to issue. It was a brutally concise cartel ultimatum printed in stark block letters. The message demanded the absolute liquidation of his assets and the full, unmitigated payment of Valerie's massive blood debt within exactly 3 days. The bottom of the paper contained a singular, chilling promise to burn the entire estate to ashes, with everyone locked inside if the financial transfer was delayed by a single hour. Willis traced the harsh ink with his thumb, feeling a cold wave of familiar recognition wash over his chest. Decades ago, long before he had built a legitimate corporate empire and acquired this sprawling mansion, he had survived the brutal, unforgiving gang wars of his youth. He remembered the metallic stench of fresh blood on concrete, the ruthless logic of desperate men, and the absolute finality of cartel violence. He knew with absolute certainty that the men who threw that brick were not issuing empty bluffs. They were highly systematic killers who viewed human life as a simple, disposable currency to balance a corrupted ledger. Valerie had arrogantly assumed she could manipulate these predators, treating them like another set of foolish investors. Instead, she had triggered a lethal countdown. Willis folded the ultimatum and placed it into his breast pocket, his mind rapidly constructing a ruthless defensive strategy to protect his legacy. The jarring, shrill ring of his private cell phone pierced the cold air of the ruined living room. Willis glanced at the caller identification screen, recognizing Bradley's secure number. He swiped to answer, bringing the speaker to his ear. Bradley was hyperventilating so violently that his words were initially indistinguishable, choking on a rapid succession of terrified wet gasps. He sounded like a man who had just looked directly into the abyss. Willis demanded clarity with a sharp, commanding tone, forcing his son-in-law to articulate the source of his profound panic. Bradley broke down completely, screaming that the cartel had just bypassed all standard security protocols to deliver a massive, ornate funeral wreath directly to his young daughter's prestigious private school. The horrific floral arrangement had been left precisely on her assigned desk, accompanied by a note containing her exact daily schedule and a photograph of the school's playground. The psychological strike was flawless, utterly destroying Bradley's arrogant facade and reducing him to a whimpering, cornered animal. He shrieked into the phone, wildly demanding that Willis immediately surrender his entire portfolio to the syndicate to satisfy Valerie's catastrophic debt. Bradley sobbed that his corporate pride and his theft of the client trust accounts no longer mattered in the face of his child's imminent execution. He pleaded for Willis to sign the asset transfer documents he had previously rejected, begging for total financial capitulation to save their physical lives. Willis listened to the pathetic wailing of the man who had confidently forged a medical document just 24 hours earlier to steal his empire. The enemy had successfully shattered the weakest link in the family chain. Willis terminated the call without uttering a single syllable of comfort, fully prepared to confront the cartel on his own brutal terms. Willis lowered the phone from his ear and severed the connection, entirely ignoring Bradley's frantic, high-pitched sobbing echoing through the receiver. Surrendering his life's work to an international criminal syndicate to clean up Valerie's catastrophic mess was not an option he would ever entertain. He had not survived the brutal, unforgiving concrete jungle of his youth, only to be extorted in his own home. He immediately contacted his elite security contractor, the same trusted former federal agent who had installed his perimeter sensors. He authorized a massive emergency expenditure to completely fortify the estate, focusing entirely on the main study, where he kept his highly sensitive physical documents. Within 12 hours, a discreet, highly specialized construction crew arrived and methodically transformed the elegant mahogany room into an impenetrable fortress. They reinforced the existing structural walls with industrial-grade ballistic steel plating, entirely concealed behind the decorative wood paneling. They replaced the standard entry doors with solid-core, heavy-duty magnetic locking mechanisms capable of withstanding localized explosive charges. The ornate bay windows were swapped for heavily tinted, bullet-resistant polycarbonate glass. Willis oversaw every single modification with absolute precision, ensuring the aesthetic beauty of the room remained completely undisturbed. He wanted the study to look exactly like the comfortable, traditional workspace his greedy family members remembered. He knew that physical intimidation was the absolute last resort of desperate men, and Bradley was the most desperate man in the city. Willis systematically arranged his legitimate original property deeds and complex bearer bonds inside his heavy desk drawers, setting the perfect, irresistible bait. He was no longer waiting for the cartel to issue demands from the shadows. He was actively preparing a customized, inescapable trap for the weakest, most predictable predator in their crumbling alliance. The crushing pressure from the cartel ultimately broke Bradley's fragile psychological state exactly as Willis had anticipated. The terrifying delivery of the funeral wreath to his daughter's prestigious private school stripped away his arrogant corporate facade, leaving behind a terrified, cornered animal willing to commit sheer lunacy to survive. Driven by pure, unadulterated panic, Bradley decided to take matters into his own trembling hands. He desperately needed immediate liquid capital to satisfy the syndicate, and he knew Willis kept original, legally binding property deeds and heavy bearer bonds locked inside his home study. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, a sleek black sedan crawled to a silent halt a block away from the estate. Bradley stepped out into the freezing night air dressed in dark, unassuming clothing that starkly contrasted with his usual tailored suits. He carried a heavy canvas duffel bag, his eyes darting frantically in every direction as he approached the wrought iron perimeter fence. He moved with the jerky, uncoordinated urgency of a man who had never committed physical burglary in his entire life, driven entirely by the ticking clock of a cartel death sentence. He clumsily scaled the masonry wall, tearing his jacket and scraping his hands against the rough brick. He landed heavily on the manicured lawn, freezing in terror as he expected floodlights to immediately bathe the yard in blinding illumination. When the property remained absolutely quiet, a false sense of superiority washed over him. He crept across the dark grass, fully convinced he was executing a flawless infiltration. He approached the rear patio doors, entirely oblivious to the high-definition night vision cameras tracking his every pathetic movement. He believed he was saving his family, but he was actively walking directly into the jaws of a predator far more dangerous than the cartel. Bradley produced a small, specialized electronic cloning device from his pocket, pressing it against the keypad of the rear patio door. He successfully bypassed the estate's original perimeter alarm system in a matter of seconds. He had covertly copied the frequency codes months ago during a family holiday dinner, demonstrating his long-standing insidious belief that he was infinitely smarter than his father-in-law. Bradley had always viewed Willis as an outdated, archaic relic of a bygone industrial era, assuming his old-school approach to business made him technologically illiterate and incredibly vulnerable to modern exploitation. He smirked in the darkness, profoundly proud of his own deceit as the heavy glass door clicked open. He navigated the silent, shadowed corridors with practiced ease, entirely unaware that Willis had permanently disabled that outdated security grid the previous afternoon. Bradley was completely blind to the secondary, independent smart grid operating silently on an isolated server documenting his exact path through the mansion. He confidently pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the main study and turned on a small tactical flashlight. He immediately lunged toward the grand executive desk, aggressively yanking open the heavy wooden drawers. He began frantically rifling through the meticulously organized files, tossing complex tax documents and corporate ledgers carelessly onto the expensive Persian rug. He was desperately hunting for the heavy watermarked paper of the original property deeds, completely consumed by his own frantic greed. His arrogance blinded him to the subtle alterations in the room. He did not notice the heavy metallic sheen of the reinforced door frame or the pristine, unblemished condition of the newly installed window panes. He felt incredibly powerful, tearing through his father-in-law's private sanctum, fully convinced he had successfully outsmarted the old man and secured the ultimate salvation for his crumbling, miserable life. Willis sat comfortably in his darkened master suite on the second floor, calmly watching Bradley tear his study apart on the glowing high-definition security monitor. He waited until Bradley had completely compromised himself, holding a thick stack of bearer bonds in his trembling hands. Willis reached out and firmly pressed the glowing red icon on his digital tablet to initiate the absolute lockdown protocol. Deep within the architecture of the study, heavy pneumatic mechanisms engaged with a terrifying mechanical hiss. The reinforced steel doors slammed shut with a deafening concussive boom, instantly sealing the room. Massive magnetic locks engaged with a heavy metallic clack, permanently fusing the doors to the ballistic steel frame. Bradley shrieked, dropping the stolen bonds and sprinting toward the exit. He clawed frantically at the brass handles, throwing his entire body weight against the immovable steel barrier. Willis leaned toward the sleek intercom microphone resting on his bedside table and spoke with an icy, unforgiving calm, informing Bradley that the room was entirely impenetrable. Bradley collapsed against the reinforced door, pounding his bloody fists against the wood paneling as sheer, unadulterated terror consumed his mind. He realized he was not a mastermind executing a daring heist, but a miserable rat caught in a perfectly engineered trap. The absolute reality of his impending doom shattered his remaining sanity. He began sobbing uncontrollably into the intercom, screaming for mercy and begging Willis to release him before the cartel assassins arrived. In his absolute hysterical panic, Bradley shrieked a confession that permanently altered the battlefield. He wailed that he desperately needed the deeds because he had secretly forged Jasmine's signature on the initial syndicate loan agreements. He had officially and legally offered his own wife to the cartel as living collateral to secure his massive debt. Willis listened to the frantic, animalistic sobbing echoing through the intercom speaker with absolute clinical detachment. Bradley's desperate confession regarding his own wife's forged collateral hung heavily in the cold air, revealing the sheer putrid depth of his moral bankruptcy. He had essentially traded Jasmine's life to buy himself a few more days of freedom from the cartel. Willis did not reach for the electronic override button, nor did he offer a single word of negotiation or comfort to the trapped, terrified man. He calmly turned away from the glowing security monitor, deliberately silencing the intercom feed to cut off the pathetic, high-pitched wailing radiating from the steel vault. Reaching into the pocket of his silk robe, he retrieved his mobile phone and dialed the local emergency dispatch line. He spoke to the 911 operator with crisp, unwavering precision, formally reporting an active, uninvited burglary in progress at his private estate by an intruder who had bypassed the exterior alarms. He explicitly stated that the dangerous perpetrator was currently contained within a reinforced room, ensuring the police would arrive with the appropriate heavy breaching equipment. Terminating the call, Willis walked methodically down the sweeping staircase toward the expansive chef's kitchen. He filled a heavy copper kettle with filtered water and placed it on the induction stove, watching the bright blue gas flame ignite in the dark room. He carefully selected a delicate porcelain teacup and a calming blend of aged chamomile, his movements steady and entirely unhurried by the crisis unfolding down the hall. He sat alone at the massive marble island, the warm mug resting perfectly between his calloused hands. The vast mansion was completely silent again, save for the faint, muffled thuds of Bradley throwing his exhausted body against immovable ballistic steel. Willis took a slow, deliberate sip of the soothing tea, his eyes fixed calmly on the digital wall clock as he waited patiently for the inevitable wail of approaching sirens to shatter the tranquil night. The flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers violently illuminated the manicured front lawn exactly 12 minutes later. Heavy combat boots pounded loudly against the polished hardwood floors as the responding officers swept into the grand foyer, their service weapons drawn and tactical flashlights piercing the dense darkness. Willis greeted them with polite composure, offering a flawless, concise summary of the perimeter breach before directing the heavily armed squad toward the sealed study. The commanding officer barked a final stern warning before Willis initiated the electronic release protocol from his master tablet. The heavy steel doors hissed open, revealing a completely broken and devastated man. Bradley was curled into a pathetic, trembling ball on the expensive Persian rug, drenched in a foul mixture of nervous sweat and sheer terror. The officers moved with brutal, practiced efficiency, forcefully hauling the weeping executive to his feet and slamming his wrists into heavy steel handcuffs. They dragged him roughly through the pristine corridors of the estate, completely ignoring his hysterical, incoherent rambling about cartel assassins and offshore debts. The ultimate humiliation was absolute as neighborhood security cameras captured the once arrogant venture capitalist being shoved violently into the back of a police cruiser in the middle of the night. Within 3 hours, the localized chaos shifted entirely to the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment of the downtown precinct. Willis sat quietly on a rigid wooden bench in the main processing lobby, systematically finalizing his formal victim statement with a lead detective. The heavy glass doors of the precinct suddenly flew open, crashing loudly against the concrete wall. Jasmine stormed into the building, her expensive designer trench coat billowing behind her like a dark cape. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, her eyes scanning the crowded room until they locked directly onto Willis. Jasmine marched directly across the scuffed linoleum floor, completely ignoring the watchful glares of the desk sergeants and the weary detectives processing the morning paperwork. She stopped inches from where Willis sat, vibrating with a toxic, unrestrained fury that flawlessly mirrored the exact chaotic energy of her biological mother, Valerie. She did not ask about the specific criminal charges or the physical well-being of her humiliated husband sitting in a cold holding cell just down the hall. Instead, she unleashed a vicious, calculated verbal assault directly at the man who had rescued her from absolute squalor. She cursed Willis with shocking venom, branding him a cold, calculating monster entirely devoid of basic human empathy or familial loyalty. Her voice echoed sharply off the cinder-block walls as she accused him of systematically destroying their family for his own sadistic amusement. Her vitriolic tirade entirely and conveniently ignored the grueling decades Willis had spent meticulously shielding her from the brutal consequences of Valerie's destructive addiction. Jasmine had completely erased the memory of the elite private academies, the fully funded luxury vehicles, and the pristine, sheltered existence built entirely upon the sweat of his brow and the permanent calluses on his hands. She stood there wearing conflict-free diamonds purchased by his corporate empire, screaming that he was an abusive tyrant for simply defending his own property against a documented burglar. Willis remained perfectly still on the uncomfortable wooden bench, his face an impenetrable wall of absolute calm. He let her hurl her venomous accusations, absorbing the vile ingratitude without blinking or raising his voice in defense. He knew that engaging with her chaotic emotional outburst would only validate her manufactured victimhood. He simply watched her unravel, waiting patiently for the inevitable moment when her blinding, arrogant rage would completely override her tactical caution and force her into making a catastrophic, irreversible mistake in front of law enforcement. Driven into a blind frenzy by Willis's absolute unwavering silence, Jasmine entirely lost control of her tongue. The cold, calculated mastermind who had flawlessly orchestrated the sophisticated embezzlement of millions of dollars suddenly disintegrated into a screaming, petulant child throwing a vicious public tantrum. She leaned aggressively over the wooden bench, pointing a manicured finger directly at his chest, her voice rising to a frantic, piercing shriek. She proudly declared that throwing Bradley in a miserable jail cell would accomplish absolutely nothing because she was the one actively holding the digital keys to the heavily encrypted offshore accounts. She screamed that she possessed the ultimate financial leverage, arrogantly boasting that Willis would pay dearly for this public humiliation. In her chaotic, unchecked fury, she completely forgot her heavily policed surroundings. She inadvertently yelled that she had meticulously laundered Bradley's embezzled client funds through a complex network of phony charitable organizations specifically registered under her maiden name in the Cayman Islands. The entire precinct lobby instantly fell dead silent. The desk sergeants abruptly stopped typing on their keyboards. The two veteran detectives standing near the coffee machine slowly turned their heads, their sharp eyes locking onto the frantic woman who had just loudly confessed to international money laundering and massive corporate fraud in a room completely filled with sworn federal and local law enforcement officers. Jasmine's chest heaved as the echo of her own catastrophic words bounced off the concrete walls. The horrifying realization of her massive tactical error finally bleeding into her widened eyes. Willis slowly stood up from the rigid wooden bench, meticulously smoothing the lapels of his charcoal jacket. He looked directly at the stunned lead detective standing just 3 feet away, giving the officer a slight acknowledging nod. The trap had flawlessly snapped shut on the final parasite. Willis did not wait for the stunned detectives in the precinct lobby to compose themselves after Jasmine's spectacular, self-incriminating outburst. He offered the lead detective a final polite nod and walked out through the heavy glass doors into the crisp morning air. He already possessed every single piece of evidence required to completely dismantle his ungrateful family, and he had absolutely no intention of letting standard police bureaucracy slow down his momentum. He directed his private driver to take him straight to the central courthouse. Upon arriving at the imposing granite building, Willis bypassed the standard civilian queues and utilized his decades of high-level corporate connections to secure an immediate closed-door meeting with the district attorney. The lead prosecutor, a formidable woman named Evelyn Vance, known for her ruthless dismantling of corporate crime syndicates, received him in her expansive wood-paneled office. Willis did not offer any superficial pleasantries or waste her valuable time with emotional, familial grievances. He unclasped his leather briefcase and methodically laid his devastating arsenal across her polished mahogany desk. He presented the high-definition digital tablet containing the undeniable video footage of Kendall bribing the corrupt clinic psychiatrist. He laid out the sprawling, catastrophic forensic audit reports detailing Bradley's massive embezzlement from his primary client trust accounts. Finally, he placed a secure audio drive containing Bradley's hysterical, tearful confession from the steel vault, explicitly detailing the systemic fraud and the unhinged attempt to steal his estate. He presented the prosecutor with an airtight, irrefutable mountain of hard evidence perfectly curated to secure immediate maximum-level federal indictments without requiring a single day of complex investigative legwork. Willis sat back in the heavy leather guest chair, steepling his fingers, and watched the prosecutor's eyes widen as she processed the sheer magnitude of the criminal conspiracy dropped directly into her lap. The district attorney meticulously reviewed the preliminary summaries of the forensic audit, her professional demeanor shifting into a state of sharp, predatory focus. Willis leaned forward, his voice maintaining an icy, unwavering calm as he laid out his precise legal proposition. He explicitly offered to hand over his son-in-law and his adopted daughter on an absolute silver platter, guaranteeing the prosecutor the highest-profile financial fraud convictions of her entire career. He articulated the exact mechanics of Bradley's reckless Ponzi scheme, detailing how the man had systematically siphoned millions from innocent investors to cover his catastrophic personal debts. Furthermore, Willis provided the exact offshore routing numbers and the Cayman Islands shell company registries that Jasmine had weaponized to launder the stolen capital through her network of phony charitable organizations. He outlined the exact flow of the illicit money, highlighting the deliberate, sophisticated steps Jasmine had taken to evade federal banking oversight. Willis made it abundantly clear that he was entirely willing to serve as the primary cooperating witness, offering his full, unmitigated support to the prosecution. He demanded absolutely no leniency or plea deals for his family members, requiring that the district attorney pursue the absolute maximum federal sentences for their staggering financial crimes and their egregious attempt at elder abuse. He wanted Bradley locked in a federal penitentiary for the remainder of his natural life, completely stripped of his tailored suits and his unearned corporate arrogance. He wanted Jasmine utterly ruined, legally exposed as a cutthroat mastermind who utilized fake charities to conceal massive theft. Willis presented the entire criminal enterprise as a perfectly wrapped gift, requiring only the swift, brutal stroke of the prosecutor's pen to initiate the immediate destruction of their fraudulent, parasitic lives. The district attorney eagerly accepted the devastating portfolio of financial crimes, recognizing the airtight nature of the evidence Willis had miraculously procured. She immediately summoned her senior federal task force to begin drafting the emergency indictments and asset seizure protocols. As she mobilized her team, Willis remained perfectly silent regarding the most lethal element of the conspiracy. He purposefully and systematically withheld every single piece of information regarding Valerie's terrifying connection to the violent international cartel syndicate. He made absolutely no mention of the heavily armed enforcers currently hunting in the city, the shattered bay window in his living room, or the brutal, blood-soaked ultimatum demanding the total liquidation of his estate. He knew that involving federal authorities in the cartel dispute would instantly trigger a massive, chaotic tactical escalation, stripping him of his personal control over the battlefield. Decades ago, surviving the ruthless, unforgiving concrete landscape of the inner city had ingrained a deeply specific, uncompromising code of justice into his very bones. In that brutal environment, calling the authorities to handle a personal blood feud was considered a sign of ultimate weakness, an invitation for absolute destruction. A man either defended his own territory with unwavering strength, or he perished. Valerie had arrogantly dragged the ghosts of that violent past directly to his doorstep, attempting to use lethal street tactics to conquer his corporate empire. Willis possessed an ironclad intention to orchestrate the total, absolute destruction of the mastermind strictly on his own terms. He would allow the federal justice system to surgically eliminate the weak, greedy pawns like Bradley and Jasmine, efficiently clearing the board. But Valerie, the toxic root of the entire infection, required a much more profound, devastating form of personal retribution that no courtroom could ever possibly deliver. The devastating machinery of federal justice moved with terrifying, unyielding speed, fueled by the pristine evidence Willis had delivered that morning. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a convoy of dark, unmarked government vehicles abruptly blocked the circular driveway of Jasmine's sprawling, immaculately manicured suburban estate. 4 senior federal agents wearing dark windbreakers bearing the stark gold letters of the FBI marched decisively up the pristine marble steps. Jasmine opened her heavy mahogany door, her face still flushed with the residual anger of her catastrophic morning outburst at the police precinct. The lead agent did not offer a polite greeting. He stepped forward and aggressively shoved a thick, legally binding federal subpoena directly into her chest. The stern document formally commanded her immediate appearance before a federal grand jury to answer for massive systemic international money laundering and severe corporate conspiracy. As Jasmine stared at the dense legal text in absolute paralyzed horror, the agent coldly informed her of the secondary judicial mandate executed by the federal courts just minutes prior. The government had initiated a total immediate emergency freeze on all of her domestic and offshore bank accounts, her investment portfolios, and her phony charitable trusts. Every single credit card bearing her name had been instantly canceled. Her massive stolen digital wealth was completely locked down, entirely inaccessible. The sudden brutal seizure effectively castrated her immense financial power, stripping her of the stolen capital she believed made her untouchable. Jasmine stood trembling in the doorway of her multi-million-dollar mansion, realizing with crushing, suffocating clarity that she could not even access enough money to hire a defense attorney or purchase a tank of gas. The untouchable mastermind had just been reduced to absolute, terrifying poverty in the blink of an eye. The devastating news of Bradley's midnight arrest and the immediate federal freeze on Jasmine's sprawling accounts reached Valerie before sunrise, sending a shockwave of absolute panic through her meticulously calculated plans. The protective buffer of her successful, easily manipulated children had evaporated overnight, leaving her entirely exposed to the lethal deadline imposed by the cartel syndicate. The 72-hour window to settle her massive blood debt was closing rapidly, and the heavy shadow of the heavily armed enforcers loomed over her every move. Cornered and completely desperate, Valerie realized she had to execute the final, most dangerous phase of her strategy personally. She dressed in an immaculate designer suit, applying a thick layer of expensive makeup to conceal the frantic terror radiating from her eyes. Armed with the heavily forged medical incapacity documents and the fraudulent living will Kendall had procured from the corrupt clinic, she stormed directly into the grand marble lobby of Willis's primary financial institution. She bypassed the standard teller lines, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished stone floor as she demanded an immediate unrecorded audience with the senior branch manager. Seated in the opulent glass-walled office, she slammed the fraudulent paperwork onto the mahogany desk. She utilized her most commanding, entitled tone, officially declaring Willis mentally unfit to manage his vast portfolio. She demanded the immediate total liquidation of Evelyn's massive trust fund, insisting the liquid capital be wired instantaneously to a specified offshore account to secure the estate's future. She weaponized her biological status, claiming this aggressive financial maneuver was a necessary, painful family intervention designed to protect her daughter's future from an unstable, deteriorating old man. In her panicked mind, the forged signatures were her ultimate shield, the golden ticket that would finally appease the ruthless killers hunting her. The senior bank manager, a stoic man with decades of executive financial experience, did not flinch at Valerie's aggressive demands or the sudden presentation of the explosive medical documents. He had been thoroughly briefed just hours prior during a highly classified, secure conference call with Willis and his elite legal counsel, Jonathan Pierce. The manager knew exactly who Valerie was and understood the precise, lethal nature of the trap he was actively helping to execute. He carefully picked up the fraudulent paperwork, adjusting his glasses to inspect the forged signatures with an expertly crafted expression of grave professional concern. He nodded sympathetically, offering a masterful performance of a concerned fiduciary bound by duty to assist a grieving family during a tragic medical crisis. He respectfully informed Valerie that all the documentation appeared to be perfectly in order and formally accepted the liquidation request for Evelyn's trust fund. However, as Valerie eagerly leaned forward to confirm the immediate wire transfer, the manager clasped his hands together and delivered the final, perfectly calibrated stall tactic. He explained with an apologetic tone that federal banking regulations strictly mandated a mandatory 72-hour legal hold on any sudden disbursement exceeding $10 million, especially when executed under a newly invoked medical power of attorney. He assured her the funds were fully secured and the transfer was officially initiated in the system, but the physical release of the capital could not legally occur before Monday morning. He slid a perfectly printed confirmation receipt across the desk, a meaningless piece of paper designed to completely pacify her escalating panic. He maintained unbroken eye contact, completely masking the fact that he had just officially documented her presentation of forged documents for the pending federal indictment. Valerie eagerly snatched the stamped confirmation receipt from the polished desk, her trembling fingers gripping the crisp paper like a victorious prize. She marched out of the bank with her head held high, entirely mistaking standard bureaucratic procedure for absolute total victory. The heavy, suffocating terror of the cartel deadline momentarily vanished, replaced by a blinding surge of euphoric arrogance. As she stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, a deeply rooted, lifelong inferiority complex finally felt satiated. For 35 years, she had watched from the miserable sidelines as Willis built an untouchable corporate empire, providing Evelyn and the rest of the family with a pristine, luxurious life she could never offer. She had abandoned her children for the chaotic thrill of the streets. Yet she had spent decades burning with a toxic, corrosive jealousy toward the man who had effortlessly succeeded where she had spectacularly failed. Willis represented everything she lacked in discipline, integrity, and genuine power. Her entire existence had been defined by a desperate, clawing need to prove she was smarter, sharper, and more cunning than the stoic patriarch who had raised the children she threw away. Holding the meaningless bank receipt, Valerie convinced herself she had finally outsmarted the great Willis. She believed she had successfully weaponized his own wealth against him, using his adopted son to secure the forged documents and his biological daughter to execute the final blow. In her twisted, arrogant perception, she had completely dismantled his legacy and reclaimed her rightful place at the absolute top of the family hierarchy. She was completely blind to the reality that she had just willingly handed federal authorities the exact physical evidence required to lock her in a maximum security prison for the remainder of her natural life. Riding high on the intoxicating rush of her perceived triumph, Valerie pulled her sleek mobile phone from her designer handbag and dialed Willis's private number. She could not resist the overwhelming urge to gloat, desperate to hear the sound of his crushing defeat. When Willis calmly answered the line, Valerie unleashed a vicious, triumphant laugh that echoed sharply inside her waiting luxury sedan. She viciously declared that she had officially won the war, bragging that Evelyn's massive trust fund was currently in the process of liquidation and entirely under her control. She mocked his outdated sense of honor and his pathetic reliance on family loyalty, proudly stating that his own children had eagerly helped her burn his empire to the ground. She promised him with sheer malice that he would be entirely locked out of his accounts, stripped of his sprawling estate and living on the cold city streets by Monday morning. She demanded he finally admit that she was the superior strategist, demanding the respect she felt she had been denied for decades. Willis sat in the quiet sanctuary of his fortified study, listening to the venomous tirade with chilling, absolute calmness. He did not raise his voice or offer a single syllable of anger in response to her taunts. When she finally paused to catch her breath, Willis simply advised her to enjoy her grand victory while it lasted. He stated in a low, even tone that he hoped she had a wonderful time at the exclusive downtown lounge where she had booked her private celebration that evening. The line went completely dead before Valerie could process how he knew her exact highly guarded evening itinerary, a sudden spike of icy dread piercing her fleeting illusion of total victory. The private dining room of the Obsidian Lounge was bathed in the warm, golden glow of crystal chandeliers radiating an atmosphere of impenetrable exclusivity. Valerie sat at the absolute head of the long mahogany table, presiding over her fractured alliance like a victorious queen claiming her conquered territory. Bradley sat to her right, freshly bailed out of the downtown precinct, his tailored jacket failing to hide the nervous tremors still vibrating through his exhausted body. Jasmine sat beside him, aggressively downing a flute of imported champagne, desperately trying to drown out the terrifying reality of her frozen bank accounts and the looming federal subpoena. She clung frantically to the false hope provided by the single bank receipt resting in the center of the table. Kendall occupied the far end, his skin a sickly shade of pale gray, chewing on his lower lip as the invisible cartel deadline continued to tick away in his mind. Valerie raised her crystal glass high into the air, demanding the attention of her fragile conspirators. She delivered a boastful, venomous toast, celebrating the imminent liquidation of the trust fund and the absolute destruction of Willis's sprawling empire. She praised their collective deception, completely ignoring the fact that they were a group of cornered, desperate criminals clinging to a manufactured victory. They clinked their glasses together in a hollow display of unity, the sharp chime of crystal ringing out as they swallowed the expensive vintage. They feasted on caviar and dry-aged steaks, entirely convinced that they had successfully outmaneuvered the patriarch. They reveled in their stolen glory, completely oblivious to the cold, undeniable fact that their luxurious celebration was nothing more than the final meal of condemned prisoners waiting for the executioner to arrive. The heavy, brass-studded oak doors of the private dining room swung open with a smooth, terrifying silence, instantly severing the manufactured joy inside the room. Willis stepped across the threshold, his posture perfectly straight, his dark, tailored suit absorbing the ambient light of the chandeliers. He carried no weapon, offered no aggressive gestures, and displayed absolutely zero anger on his composed features. He simply radiated an aura of absolute crushing authority that instantly consumed all the oxygen in the opulent space. The boisterous laughter died in the throats of his enemies, replaced by a sudden suffocating dread that pinned them to their velvet chairs. Valerie's triumphant smile physically froze her hand, pausing midway to her mouth with her champagne flute hovering in midair. Bradley physically flinched instinctively, pressing his back against the upholstery as the phantom memory of the locking steel vault rushed back into his panicked mind. Jasmine lowered her gaze entirely, unable to maintain eye contact with the man she had viciously cursed in the police precinct lobby just hours prior. Kendall simply stopped breathing, his wide eyes locked onto Willis like a prey animal caught in the unyielding gaze of an apex predator. Willis did not speak a single word as he methodically walked toward the center of the room. He absorbed the sheer panic radiating from his treacherous family, analyzing their physical reactions with clinical precision. He allowed the heavy, oppressive silence to stretch out for an agonizing eternity, weaponizing the quiet to dismantle the last remaining shreds of their fabricated confidence. He simply stood there, a towering monolith of consequence, forcing every single person at the table to silently acknowledge that the master of the estate had finally arrived to collect his ultimate toll. The suffocating tension finally broke Bradley's fragile composure. Desperate to reclaim a sliver of his shattered masculine pride, he abruptly pushed his chair back and stood up, his knees trembling slightly against the edge of the table. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Willis, his voice cracking as he loudly declared that physical intimidation would no longer work. He arrogantly shouted that Valerie possessed the official bank liquidation receipt, falsely claiming that Willis was entirely stripped of his power, his capital, and his influence. Willis ignored the pathetic outburst entirely. He did not grant Bradley the dignity of a glance. Instead, Willis stepped forward and casually inspected the lavish feast spread across the table, his eyes lingering on the empty caviar tins and half-empty bottles of vintage champagne. He spoke in a low, gravelly tone, noting that traitors always share the exact same fatal flaw. They are entirely incapable of delaying gratification, choosing to celebrate prematurely on the absolute illusion of success. He recounted a brief, brutal memory from the corporate wars of the late 80s, describing a ruthless syndicate of hostile takeover specialists who had tried the exact same maneuver against his first logistics company. They had gathered in a similar restaurant, drinking identical champagne, wholly convinced they had cornered his assets. Willis explained that while they were toasting their stolen glory, he had been quietly purchasing their core debt from their anonymous creditors. He stated that borrowed power is incredibly fragile because it lacks the endurance built through actual suffering and legitimate sacrifice. He finally turned his cold, penetrating gaze toward Valerie, informing her that the paper receipt she guarded so fiercely was nothing more than a digital tracking device designed to perfectly secure her permanent federal incarceration. Before Valerie could process the horrifying weight of that revelation, Willis raised his right hand and delivered a single sharp snap of his fingers. The crisp sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Immediately, two men dressed in immaculate dark corporate suits stepped through the open oak doors and flanked Willis with military precision. The man on the left was Jonathan Pierce Willis's fiercely loyal and profoundly ruthless lead legal counsel carrying a thick, heavily secured leather briefcase. The second man was entirely unfamiliar to the traders at the table. He possessed the cold, calculating demeanor of a corporate assassin, his eyes completely devoid of human warmth. He stepped forward and placed a pristine business card directly onto the table, squarely in front of Valerie's trembling hands. He introduced himself with a chillingly polite tone as the chief legal representative and senior acquisitions director of Titan Group. The name landed in the room like an explosive charge. Titan Group was not a local bank or a standard investment firm. It was a colossal multinational financial conglomerate infamous for dismantling failing corporations, liquidating toxic assets, and legally crushing anyone caught in their sprawling international crosshairs. The sheer magnitude of their presence instantly shifted the entire dynamic of the conflict. This was no longer a petty domestic dispute over a forged will or a hijacked trust fund. Willis had completely bypassed the standard family court arena and deliberately invited an apex corporate predator directly into their localized war. The horrifying realization crashed over Valerie and her conspirators simultaneously. Willis had not simply frozen their accounts or reported them to the local authorities. He had officially sold their massive fraudulent cartel debt directly to the most unforgiving financial syndicate on the planet. Willis stepped up to the head of the table, his presence commanding absolute submission from the terrified group. He extended his hand backward, and Jonathan Pierce immediately placed a massive leather-bound contract into his palm. The document was thick, bound in dark leather and sealed with heavy corporate embossing. Willis did not gently set it down. He hurled the massive folio directly onto the absolute center of the mahogany dining table. The heavy binder struck the polished wood with a resounding crack, violently knocking over Kendall's crystal champagne flute. The expensive vintage spilled across the pristine white linen tablecloth, dripping steadily onto the floor, but no one dared to move a single muscle to clean it up. Willis leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table, and locked his cold, unforgiving eyes directly onto Valerie. He broke the suffocating silence with a voice as sharp and unyielding as a steel blade. He calmly announced that exactly 3 weeks ago, immediately following the physical altercation on his porch, where Valerie had the sheer audacity to slap him across the face, he had initiated a devastating silent financial maneuver. That single arrogant strike had been the ultimate catalyst, officially severing his final remaining ties of emotional restraint. While Valerie had been busy orchestrating her clumsy, desperate conspiracy with a corrupt clinic, and while Bradley and Jasmine were frantically plotting to seize his assets, Willis had been quietly dismantling the very foundation they intended to steal. He explained that he had not spent the last month mourning their betrayal or defending his sanity. Instead, he had meticulously prepared a financial scorched earth protocol. He watched the blood drain entirely from Valerie's face as he revealed that the wealth she thought she had conquered no longer existed in any accessible form. Willis gestured toward the representative from Titan Group, formally introducing the man as the new absolute owner of the estate and everything attached to it. He systematically explained the monumental scale of his retaliation, delivering each sentence with the precision of a judge reading a final verdict. He had not simply moved his money into offshore accounts or restructured his holding companies to delay their theft. He had actively and aggressively sold his entire sprawling corporate empire. Every single investment fund, every lucrative commercial property, and the very mansion they had attempted to steal were now the exclusive property of Titan Group. The transaction was absolute, legally bulletproof, and entirely irreversible. Willis detailed how he had liquidated his massive lifetime portfolio at a deliberate, calculated discount, specifically choosing a multinational conglomerate notorious for its absolute ruthlessness in asset acquisition and hostile corporate takeovers. He had intentionally transferred his wealth into a monolithic entity that operated far beyond the reach of local family court judges and fraudulent medical declarations. The ink had dried, the federal wire transfers had cleared, and the physical deeds were securely locked inside a subterranean vault in Switzerland. Willis watched Bradley's jaw drop in sheer, unadulterated horror as the magnitude of the situation registered in his panicked mind. The vast, limitless fortune they had all salivated over, the multi-million-dollar safety net they had desperately relied upon to save them from the cartel, had completely evaporated. Willis stated clearly that the Titan Group did not negotiate with local criminals, nor did they recognize forged medical documents or fraudulent powers of attorney. He had legally reduced his own massive empire to zero, choosing to walk away with nothing, rather than allow parasites to feast upon a single cent of his legacy. The utter finality of the transaction crushed the remaining breath from the room, but Willis was not finished dismantling their pathetic illusions. He systematically broke down the brutal, inescapable reality of their new existence, drip-feeding the precise details of their absolute ruin. He turned his icy gaze toward Bradley, explaining that the venture capital firm Bradley had so arrogantly used to embezzle client trust accounts was functionally dead. The parent holding company that provided Bradley's firm with its foundational liquidity had been entirely absorbed by the Titan acquisition. Bradley no longer held a legitimate position. He was the unauthorized occupant of a bankrupt shell entity. Willis then looked at Jasmine, whose eyes were wide with sheer terror. He informed her that the lucrative corporate shares she had proudly leveraged to secure her lavish lifestyle and fund her phony charitable organizations had been legally voided and restructured during the buyout. Her equity was completely wiped out, leaving her with massive unpayable debt and zero corporate protection. Finally, Willis stepped directly in front of Valerie. He leaned down, bringing his face inches from hers, and whispered the most devastating truth of all. The massive trust fund she had desperately attempted to liquidate that very afternoon at the bank was no longer his to disperse. Evelyn's trust had been entirely absorbed by Titan Group's legal division as part of the overarching corporate sale. Valerie had stormed into that financial institution waving a fraudulent piece of paper, demanding millions from an account that officially belonged to a faceless, aggressively litigious, multinational corporation. They had spent weeks plotting to hijack a grand, luxurious cruise ship, entirely unaware that Willis had deliberately steered the vessel straight into the abyss and handed the salvage rights to a megalodon. The crushing weight of their absolute destruction settled over the private dining room, suffocating the conspirators in a thick, inescapable blanket of dread. They possessed absolutely nothing, trapped between the relentless demands of a violent cartel and the total evaporation of their targeted salvation. Before any of them could muster the strength to articulate a single pathetic defense, the Titan Group representative stepped forward. He cleared his throat, a sharp, incredibly precise sound that commanded instant attention from the trembling group. His face remained a flawless mask of corporate indifference as he smoothly unlatched his heavy briefcase. He reached inside and produced a thick, professionally bound legal document printed on stark, heavy cardstock. He did not hand it to Willis. Instead, he walked directly around the mahogany table and placed it squarely in front of Bradley. The representative spoke with a chilling, perfectly modulated voice, officially introducing himself not merely as an acquisition manager, but as the Senior Director of Corporate Debt Recovery. He informed Bradley that Titan Group had completed a comprehensive forensic audit of all subsidiary accounts during the acquisition phase. The document resting on the table was a formal, non-negotiable legal mandate demanding immediate asset recovery and total debt restitution for the millions Bradley had illegally siphoned from the newly acquired client trust accounts. The representative clearly articulated that Titan Group was officially holding Bradley personally and criminally liable for the massive financial deficit. The corporate titan was not simply repossessing the holding company, they were actively initiating a relentless legal siege to extract every single stolen dollar directly from Bradley's personal estate. The trap had flawlessly snapped shut, perfectly transforming the arrogant predators into legally bound prey, entirely at the mercy of an entity that felt absolutely zero pity. The Senior Director of Corporate Debt Recovery did not raise his voice to cut through the suffocating dread filling the private dining room. He spoke with the terrifying mechanized precision of a man who possessed unlimited corporate resources and absolutely zero capacity for mercy. He informed Bradley that Titan Group's elite forensic accountants had already traced every single unauthorized wire transfer, officially calculating the exact sum of the embezzled client funds at a staggering $3 million. The representative leaned forward, tapping his manicured index finger against the heavy cardstock of the legal mandate. He delivered a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum, declaring that Bradley had exactly 48 hours to reimburse the stolen capital in its entirety. If the massive deficit was not completely satisfied down to the final cent by the designated deadline, Titan's aggressive legal army would bypass civil litigation entirely and hand the pristine audit reports directly to the federal prosecutor's office. The corporate assassin meticulously outlined the severe federal sentencing guidelines for grand larceny, wire fraud, and systemic corporate embezzlement, ensuring Bradley fully understood that he was facing decades inside a maximum security penitentiary. The representative adjusted his silk tie and explicitly clarified that Titan Group did not accept payment plans, nor did they entertain pathetic pleas for leniency from corporate thieves. Bradley stared at the mandate, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single coherent sound. The undeniable reality of his catastrophic failure anchored him heavily to the velvet chair. He could not liquidate his firm to cover the debt because Willis had just sold the parent company. He could not leverage his private estate because he had already secretly mortgaged it to the breaking point. The financial noose pulled tight, instantly choking the last remnants of oxygen from his lungs. The sheer gravity of the corporate ultimatum acted as a violent catalyst, instantly incinerating the fragile alliance that had bound the treacherous family together. Absolute panic flooded the opulent room, immediately dissolving their manufactured unity into vicious, unrestrained infighting. Bradley violently shoved his chair backward and turned his terror directly onto Jasmine, his face flushed with a dark, explosive rage. He screamed that he was facing federal prison entirely because she refused to curb her reckless, insatiable spending habits. He brutally detailed how her obsession with imported luxury cars and high-society charity galas had rapidly drained his legitimate accounts, forcing him to siphon the trust funds in a desperate bid to maintain their flawless social facade. Jasmine retaliated with matching venom, hurling her champagne flute across the table where it shattered against the mahogany wood, sending sharp crystal shards and expensive vintage raining down onto the floor. She viciously deflected the blame, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at Valerie. Jasmine shrieked that her biological mother was the true architect of their impending doom, cursing the older woman for dragging a lethal international cartel syndicate directly to their suburban doorstep. The private dining room degenerated into a chaotic, screaming snake pit as the three predators turned their fangs upon one another, desperately trying to assign blame for a conspiracy they had all willingly built. Kendall remained entirely separated from the screaming match, violently paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the destruction. He dropped heavily to the floor, crawling into the far corner of the lavish room, hugging his knees to his chest while sobbing uncontrollably into the expensive fabric of his suit. He wept for the innocent, privileged life he had permanently destroyed just to win the approval of a mother who was currently screaming profanities at her own daughter. Willis stood silently near the heavy oak doors, watching the total implosion of his family with absolute chilling detachment. He did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse as the violent screaming echoed off the crystal chandeliers. This pathetic, degrading spectacle was the exact, undeniable manifestation of unearned greed actively consuming itself. He watched them tear each other apart and remembered the grueling, unforgiving decades he had spent building his very first logistics company from a single rusted delivery truck. He had endured freezing nights sleeping in shipping yards, surviving on stale coffee and sheer willpower, learning early that true strength was forged strictly through legitimate sacrifice and relentless discipline. He had handed these people the fruits of his monumental labor on a silver platter, offering them a pristine existence entirely shielded from the brutal struggles of his youth. Instead of honoring that immense privilege, they had viewed his generosity as a weakness to be exploited, foolishly believing they could steal a crown they lacked the spine to wear. They were hollow replicas of success, completely devoid of the moral fortitude required to survive a genuine war. Willis buttoned his charcoal jacket, feeling the profound, liberating silence of a man who had finally cut out a malignant cancer. He did not offer a parting speech or a final dramatic declaration of victory to the warring faction. He simply turned his back on the screaming traitors, walking purposefully out of the private dining room alongside Jonathan Pierce and the Titan Group representative. He left them completely abandoned in their self-made hell, perfectly sealing their inevitable fate within the walls of the luxury establishment they could no longer possibly afford. The blinding noise of Bradley and Jasmine's vicious screaming match faded into the background as a cold, terrifying realization suddenly paralyzed Valerie. She stood frozen at the head of the ruined dining table, clutching the edges of her designer handbag as the true horror of her total isolation finally registered. The massive trust fund was officially gone. Bradley was entirely bankrupt, and her own daughter was currently threatening to testify against her to federal authorities. She possessed absolutely no liquid capital, completely stripping her of any ability to satisfy the massive blood debt she owed to the international syndicate. The 72-hour cartel deadline was no longer an abstract threat. It was an imminent lethal reality bearing down heavily on her neck. Driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct, Valerie slipped away from the chaotic argument, abandoning her hysterical children without a second thought. She pushed her way through the heavy swinging doors leading into the restaurant's bustling industrial kitchen, her expensive heels slipping dangerously on the greased tile floor. She completely ignored the confused shouts of the culinary staff, keeping her wide eyes locked entirely on the glowing red exit sign marking the rear loading dock. She crashed violently through the heavy metal security doors, stumbling out into the freezing, damp air of the back alleyway. Valerie gasped for breath, her chest heaving as she desperately scanned the dark street for a passing taxi to facilitate her immediate escape from the city. She stopped dead in her tracks, the remaining blood draining rapidly from her pale face. 3 black, heavily tinted SUVs sat idling menacingly side by side, completely barricading the narrow alleyway and blocking her only physical route of escape. The heavy passenger doors swung open in absolute unison. The clock in Willis's private study chimed exactly 3 times, the deep, resonant metallic strikes echoing through the absolute stillness of his heavily fortified estate. He sat in his leather armchair, entirely awake, fully anticipating the inevitable fallout of the evening's catastrophic corporate execution. The heavy silence of the room was abruptly shattered by the sharp, persistent vibration of his secure mobile phone resting on the mahogany desk. The caller identification display flashed Kendall's name. Willis allowed the device to ring for a long, agonizing moment before calmly lifting it to his ear. On the other end of the line, Kendall's voice was completely unrecognizable. It was a frantic, tear-soaked whisper vibrating with the kind of primal terror reserved for prey caught in the jaws of an apex predator. Kendall choked out his words in a rapid, disjointed stream of absolute panic. He explained that Valerie had managed to drag them to a temporary, unlisted suburban hideout after the disastrous confrontation at the restaurant, desperately hoping to evade the international syndicate for a few more hours. But the cartel enforcers were highly trained professionals, and they had flawlessly tracked her erratic movements. Kendall wept into the receiver, violently trembling as he described the immediate horror unfolding outside their windows. He stated that heavily armed tactical teams had completely surrounded the perimeter of the safe house. He could hear the heavy thud of combat boots against the wooden porch and the sharp metallic clatter of automatic weapons being primed in the darkness. The syndicate was actively breaching the exterior doors, methodically collapsing the net around Valerie and her terrified conspirators. Kendall whispered that they had exactly minutes before the enforcers broke through the final barricade and initiated their brutal, bloody collection protocol. Weeping with unadulterated desperation, Kendall begged Willis to authorize an immediate emergency override of the estate's security perimeter. He pleaded for Willis to unlock the reinforced steel gates, desperately asking him to dispatch his private security detail to extract them from the compromised hideout and provide a permanent safe haven within his impenetrable fortress. In his blind panic, Kendall rapidly weaponized the emotional history they once shared repeatedly, calling Willis "Dad" in a frantic, hysterical attempt to resurrect the ghost of their familial bond. He sobbed into the phone, reminding Willis of the countless times he had shielded them from the brutal consequences of their own reckless mistakes over the past 3 decades. Kendall promised absolute obedience, vowing that they would surrender everything, confess to every corporate crime, and permanently submit to Willis's authority if he would simply open the gates and save their lives one final time. He used the word father like a desperate magical incantation, completely convinced that the old man's inherent, deeply ingrained sense of paternal duty would instinctively override his logical desire for retribution. Kendall painted a pathetic, horrifying picture of their imminent execution, demanding that Willis acknowledge his moral obligation to protect the family he had painstakingly built. He cried out that Valerie was currently huddled on the floor of the safe house, entirely paralyzed by the terror she had arrogantly summoned. Kendall laid his life entirely at the feet of the patriarch, demanding a rescue mission based purely on the unearned privilege of his adoption. He expected Willis to act as the eternal safety net, blindly catching them after they had deliberately cut the suspension wires and proudly pushed him toward the abyss. Willis did not offer a single word of comfort to interrupt Kendall's hysterical, tearful pleading. He lowered the phone slightly, lifting a delicate porcelain cup to his lips and taking a slow, measured sip of hot tea. He gazed out through the reinforced bulletproof glass of his study window, watching the serene, perfectly illuminated security perimeter of his quiet garden. The estate was a pristine fortress of peace, entirely devoid of the chaos and violence that currently threatened to consume his treacherous relatives. He allowed his mind to reflect on the immense, suffocating burden of the paternal duty he had carried for over 40 years. He had willingly absorbed their failures, quietly paying off their massive debts, hiding their endless scandals, and building a towering corporate empire solely to insulate them from the unforgiving cruelty of the real world. He had believed that providing absolute security would eventually breed genuine character. Instead, his relentless protection had only cultivated a profound, toxic entitlement. Willis recognized with absolute clarity that a father's sacred duty immediately terminates the very second a child deliberately raises a poisoned knife to his back. He brought the phone back to his ear, his voice perfectly steady and entirely devoid of human warmth. He spoke over Kendall's frantic sobbing, calmly stating that physical protection and financial salvation are not fundamental human rights. He explained that security is an exclusive, highly guarded privilege strictly reserved for those who demonstrate unwavering loyalty. He reminded Kendall that he had willingly aligned himself with a parasite actively participating in a calculated, malicious conspiracy to destroy the very man who had given him his name. Willis finalized his judgment, declaring that traitors simply do not get to seek shelter in the castle they actively attempted to burn to the ground. Kendall shrieked into the receiver, the sound tearing through his throat as the heavy crack of splintering wood echoed loudly in the background of the call. The cartel enforcers were actively breaking through the front door of the hideout, and his time had completely run out. He screamed one final desperate plea for Willis to unlock the estate gates. Willis flatly and absolutely refused. He stated in a voice as cold as glacial ice that his reinforced steel doors would remain permanently sealed against them. He would not compromise the safety of his sanctuary to harbor the architects of his attempted destruction. However, Willis added that he would offer them exactly one final piece of guidance. He calmly informed Kendall that he was currently sending a highly encrypted text message containing a single specific address. He instructed Kendall to memorize the location and immediately surrender himself, Valerie, and the rest of the conspirators directly to that exact building. Willis framed the destination as the absolute last remaining stronghold in the entire city, capable of shielding them from the ruthless wrath of the international syndicate. Kendall did not hesitate. Blinded by overwhelming terror and sheer desperation, he accepted the mysterious address as a miraculous lifeline. He thanked Willis hysterically, sobbing profound words of gratitude and promising eternal loyalty before abruptly terminating the call to flee. Kendall grabbed Valerie and dragged her toward the rear exit, completely and entirely unaware of the true nature of their destination. He did not realize that Willis had just sent them the direct coordinates to the heavily guarded central headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, effectively driving the panicked criminals straight into the inescapable jaws of a maximum security federal prosecution. Kendall pushed the stolen sedan's accelerator straight to the floorboards, tearing through the rain-slicked city streets with absolutely zero regard for red lights or oncoming traffic. Valerie sat beside him in the passenger seat, her immaculate designer suit ruined by rain and sweat violently gripping the dashboard as she hyperventilated. In the rearview mirror, the glaring headlights of the three black cartel SUVs maintained a relentless, terrifying proximity. The syndicate enforcers drove with cold mechanical precision, expertly cornering Kendall at every intersection and actively boxing the sedan toward the industrial district. Kendall possessed no evasive driving skills. He was merely a pampered beneficiary of Willis's wealth, entirely unequipped to navigate a lethal urban hunt. He blindly followed the GPS coordinates glowing on his phone, repeating the address aloud like a desperate prayer for salvation. He firmly believed his adopted father had provided them with an impenetrable corporate safe house, a hidden fortress where Willis's private security contractors would neutralize the threat. As the electronic map indicated they had arrived at their exact destination, Kendall wildly jerked the steering wheel, sending the sedan skidding violently across the wet pavement. The vehicle violently hopped the curb, shattering a wooden barrier gate before crashing heavily into a concrete planter box inside an expansive fenced-in parking plaza. The engine hissed and smoked as Kendall kicked his door open, grabbing Valerie by the arm and dragging her out into the freezing downpour. They stumbled frantically across the asphalt, seeking immediate refuge from the approaching cartel vehicles. They threw their hands in the air, screaming for Willis's invisible guards to emerge from the shadows and open the reinforced steel doors of the massive dark building looming directly in front of them. The heavy darkness of the plaza vanished instantly as a blinding array of high-intensity security floodlights erupted from the perimeter walls. The sudden searing illumination pinned Kendall and Valerie to the wet asphalt like insects caught under a microscope. As their eyes desperately adjusted to the piercing glare, the horrifying reality of Willis's final sanctuary materialized before them. They had not crashed into a private corporate bunker or a secluded residential fortress. Towering over them was a brutalist concrete structure bearing the massive, unmistakable bronze seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Willis had orchestrated a flawless, lethal misdirection. He had actively weaponized their sheer panic, steering the desperate conspirators precisely to the one location where their destruction was legally guaranteed. He had not spent the past week merely securing his own assets. He had meticulously prepared the legal battlefield. 3 days prior, Willis had anonymously transmitted a heavily encrypted digital dossier directly to the senior director of the FBI's Cybercrimes Task Force. The package contained pristine, undeniable copies of the offshore ledger books Kendall had foolishly helped Valerie establish. It detailed the exact routing numbers, the Cayman Islands shell corporations, and the precise flow of the cartel's illicit drug capital moving through Valerie's fraudulent network. Willis had provided the federal government with a perfectly curated map of an international money laundering syndicate, entirely eliminating the need for a lengthy, complex federal investigation. By providing Kendall with this specific address, Willis had ensured that Valerie and her cartel executioners arrived simultaneously at the absolute epicenter of federal law enforcement, perfectly wrapping up his enemies and delivering them directly into the waiting jaws of the United States justice system. The deafening shriek of sirens shattered the night as heavily armed federal agents swarmed the illuminated parking lot from every conceivable angle. The cartel enforcers, realizing they had been masterfully baited directly into a massive federal trap, violently slammed their SUVs into reverse in a desperate bid to escape. A chaotic, bloody firefight was narrowly avoided as armored tactical vehicles aggressively rammed the syndicate cars, pinning the heavy black vehicles against the reinforced concrete barriers. SWAT teams instantly neutralized the cartel hitmen, shattering their tinted windows and dragging the heavily armed killers out onto the pavement. Amidst the deafening roar of shouting agents and barking dogs, Valerie attempted to execute her lifelong survival strategy. Decades ago, she had cowardly slipped out the back door of a cramped apartment, abandoning her crying children to escape the suffocating pressure of motherhood. She had built her entire existence on fleeing consequence, convinced she could always outrun the damage she caused. She turned to sprint toward the chaotic perimeter, abandoning a frozen, weeping Kendall without a single ounce of maternal hesitation. But the physical toll of decades of arrogance had finally caught up to her. 2 federal agents tackled her from behind, driving her forcefully into the rough, freezing asphalt. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, scraping her expensive makeup against the wet gravel. As the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around her wrists, the crushing realization of her absolute failure settled over her. Her fake charities, her stolen funds, and her manipulative grandstanding had all been systematically neutralized. The brilliant mastermind lay pinned in the mud, entirely stripped of her power, permanently denied the exit door she had always relied upon to survive. The devastating shockwave of Willis's retaliation did not end in the flooded FBI parking lot. Simultaneously, precisely synchronized with Valerie's arrest, a convoy of unmarked federal marshals aggressively breached the quiet, manicured streets of Bradley's exclusive suburban neighborhood. They did not bother ringing the doorbell. They violently kicked down the heavy mahogany front door of his sprawling mansion, storming the lavish foyer with flashlights and drawn weapons. Bradley was dragged out onto his pristine front lawn, wearing only his silk pajamas, his hands firmly cuffed behind his back as his wealthy, influential neighbors watched the humiliating spectacle from their windows. The Titan Group had executed their threat flawlessly, delivering the irrefutable embezzlement audit directly to the district attorney. Jasmine, sobbing hysterically in her ruined dining room, received her own brutal reckoning when federal process servers handed her a dense legal subpoena, formally charging her as a primary co-conspirator in massive corporate wire fraud. Back in the floodlit FBI plaza, a terrified, weeping Kendall was aggressively slammed against the hood of a federal cruiser, read his Miranda rights, and arrested for his direct involvement in the international money laundering syndicate. The parasitic network had been entirely eradicated in a single devastating night. Miles away from the sirens and the screaming, Willis sat alone in the quiet sanctuary of his darkened living room. He held a crystal glass of aged bourbon, his eyes locked onto the glowing screen of his television as local news networks began flashing the breaking alerts of the massive cartel takedown and corporate arrests. His expression remained entirely unreadable, devoid of any triumphant joy or lingering sorrow. He simply took a slow, measured sip of his drink, finally embracing the profound, absolute silence of an empty, secure kingdom. 2 agonizing days dragged by after the monumental federal sweep that utterly eradicated the fraudulent criminal network. Within that short, brutal 48-hour window, the pristine reality Jasmine and Kendall had always taken for granted was violently stripped away. They barely managed to secure temporary release bonds, leveraging the absolute last remnants of their maxed-out, heavily monitored credit lines just to escape a federal holding cell. The transition from untouchable corporate elites to desperate, exposed criminals was physically jarring. They possessed no access to their frozen bank accounts, no offshore lifelines, and no powerful friends willing to associate with federally indicted felons. Stripped of their immense wealth, their arrogant pride, and their impeccably tailored designer wardrobes, they were reduced to wearing the wrinkled, unwashed clothes they had been arrested in. The cold, unrelenting rain from the night of the raid seemed to have permanently washed away their curated glamour. Desperation, pure and suffocating, drove them back to the only sanctuary they had ever known. They trudged up the long, winding driveway of Willis's fortified estate, their expensive shoes scuffed and ruined by the long walk from the public transit station they were forced to use. They looked exactly like the helpless beggars they had always sneered at from the tinted windows of their luxury sedans. The imposing wrought iron gates, which had always swung open automatically to welcome them into a world of limitless privilege, remained firmly sealed. The towering stone walls of the mansion stood as a silent, impenetrable fortress, completely indifferent to their sudden, catastrophic poverty. They stood shivering in the driveway, entirely stripped of their arrogance, facing the terrifying reality that the man they had relentlessly plotted to destroy was now their absolute last hope for survival. The heavy security gates finally groaned open with a slow, mechanized hum, granting them access not out of lingering affection, but as a deliberate, calculated allowance for their final judgment. Jasmine and Kendall stumbled up the pristine walkway, their legs giving out as they reached the grand entrance. They collapsed heavily onto the cold concrete steps of the expansive front porch, dropping to their knees in a pathetic display of total submission. The sheer magnitude of the federal charges hanging over their heads broke whatever fragile composure they had left. They wept openly, their desperate sobs echoing against the stone pillars of the quiet estate. Jasmine clutched at the hem of her ruined dress, pleading hysterically for Willis to intervene. She begged him to mobilize Jonathan Pierce and his elite undefeated legal team, insisting that his corporate lawyers were the only force on earth capable of saving them from spending the next 3 decades decaying inside a federal penitentiary. Kendall joined the frantic chorus, his voice cracking as he promised absolute, unquestioning obedience. He swore through his tears that they had learned their lesson, desperately vowing to abandon their toxic ambition and finally become the loyal, respectful children Willis had always deserved. They offered hollow apologies for their horrific betrayal, weaponizing their tears in a final pathetic attempt to manipulate the patriarch's legendary protective instincts. They groveled on the hard concrete, entirely willing to trade the last shreds of their dignity for a miraculous legal salvation, completely failing to realize that the currency of their promises had been permanently devalued. They wept for mercy from a man they had shown absolutely none, blindly hoping that a lifetime of unearned forgiveness would be extended to them one last time. The heavy oak front door unlatched and swung inward, revealing Willis standing perfectly framed in the warm light of the foyer. He stepped out onto the wide concrete porch, looking down at the 2 weeping figures crumpled at his feet. His face was a mask of absolute chilling tranquility. There was no trace of the fiery rage that had once defined his battles, nor was there any lingering sorrow for the family he was actively discarding. The profound emotional bond that naturally tethers a father to his children had been cleanly and surgically severed the exact night Valerie had arrogantly slapped him across the face in this very spot. That singular, violently disrespectful strike had not merely insulted his pride, it had permanently shattered the illusion that his relentless financial protection could ever cultivate genuine moral character. He realized then that his decades of silent sacrifice had only enabled their monstrous greed. He had spent 40 years building a colossal fortress to keep them safe, only to discover they were the true predators waiting inside the walls. Willis looked at Jasmine and Kendall, feeling nothing but the cold, liberating clarity of a man who had finally excised a fatal infection. He did not raise his voice to match their hysterical screaming, nor did he offer a single word of comforting reassurance to ease their panic. Instead, he reached calmly into the inner pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. His movements were slow and deliberate as he withdrew a small, tight stack of cheap, generic business cards. The flimsy cardstock lacked the heavy embossing and gold foil of the elite corporate attorneys they were desperately begging for, representing a vastly different, deeply unforgiving reality. Willis extended his hand and let the small stack of flimsy business cards slip from his fingers. The cheap paper fluttered down through the crisp morning air, landing directly in the small puddles of rainwater gathered around Jasmine and Kendall's trembling knees. He spoke with a low, even tone that cut through their frantic sobbing with surgical precision. He informed them that those cards contained the direct contact numbers for the state-appointed public defender's office. They were not receiving the flawless multi-million-dollar defense strategies of Jonathan Pierce or the impenetrable corporate shielding of Titan Group. They were going to rely on vastly overworked, severely underfunded government lawyers to fight their massive federal indictments. Willis then retrieved a single stark white legal document from his jacket. It bore the heavy, undeniable notary seals of the state Supreme Court. He dropped the crisp paper onto the concrete beside the scattered business cards. He stated clearly that the document was a finalized, legally binding mandate, officially severing all familial, legal, and financial ties between them. He was no longer their father, their benefactor, or their safety net. They had arrogantly demanded independence, and he was finally granting them the absolute terrifying freedom to face the catastrophic consequences of their own actions. Willis did not wait for their horrified realization to fully materialize. He turned his back on the weeping traitors, his polished shoes echoing sharply against the stone as he walked back inside. The heavy oak door closed behind him with a resonant metallic click as the deadbolts engaged, permanently locking them out of his world. He left them kneeling in the cold dampness of the driveway, entirely abandoned to the merciless machinery of the federal justice system they had so arrogantly tried to manipulate. Time moved forward with an unyielding, restorative rhythm, methodically washing away the lingering debris of the shattered conspiracy. The federal justice system, armed with the pristine evidence Willis had meticulously curated, operated with absolute efficiency. The highly publicized trials concluded without a single concession or plea deal. Bradley stood before a federal judge completely stripped of his tailored suits and corporate arrogance, and received a devastating 40-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary for his massive systemic embezzlement. Valerie, dragged out of the blinding floodlights of the FBI plaza, faced an even harsher reality. Her sprawling network of international money laundering combined with her egregious attempts at medical fraud and cartel collaboration earned her a permanent, inescapable residence behind reinforced steel bars for the remainder of her natural life. She traded the illusion of high society dominance for a concrete cell, forever trapped by the very authorities she foolishly believed she could outsmart. Meanwhile, Jasmine and Kendall were spared physical incarceration, but condemned to an entirely different form of absolute ruin. The federal government seized every remaining asset they possessed to satisfy the staggering financial restitutions tied to their fraudulent charities and corporate complicity. Stripped of their stolen wealth, their unearned pride, and their hollow social standing, they were violently thrust into the unforgiving reality they had always despised. The once untouchable heirs were legally mandated to perform grueling, exhausting manual labor just to survive, working endless minimum wage shifts to pay back millions in court-ordered debt. Their manicured hands grew calloused, and their relentless ambition was entirely crushed under the suffocating weight of absolute bankruptcy. They had demanded total independence from Willis's protective shadow, and the universe had ruthlessly granted their wish, leaving them completely abandoned in a cold, unforgiving world they were utterly unequipped to navigate. With the parasitic infection permanently eradicated, Willis's sprawling estate returned to a state of pristine, undisturbed tranquility. The heavy, suffocating tension that had plagued the grand halls for months evaporated entirely, replaced by the profound peace of a fortress completely purged of traitors. The polished marble floors and the towering oak doors no longer echoed with the frantic, scheming whispers of ungrateful children plotting their next theft. Willis had surgically removed the malignant toxicity from his life, and the resulting silence was not lonely, but deeply, incredibly liberating. He had successfully liquidated a lifetime of monumental corporate success into a massive, untouchable reservoir of liquid capital through the irreversible Titan Group acquisition. Instead of hoarding that immense wealth or hiding it away in stagnant offshore accounts, Willis chose to channel his vast resources into a new, formidable endeavor that aligned perfectly with his unyielding principles. He established a massive, heavily endowed educational foundation structured with the exact same ruthless efficiency he had used to build his original logistics empire. This new institution was legally bulletproof, governed by a fiercely loyal board of directors led by Jonathan Pierce, ensuring that no greedy relative or opportunistic predator could ever siphon a single cent from its deeply protected coffers. Willis transformed the ashes of his personal betrayal into a towering monument of genuine philanthropy, redirecting the colossal financial power that his children had desperately tried to steal toward a cause that actually held legitimate merit. The fortune that had bred nothing but toxic entitlement and malicious conspiracy in his own home was now officially weaponized for absolute good, forever sealed away from the grasping, entitled hands of those who believed they could inherit greatness without earning it through honest, grueling sacrifice. The newly minted foundation bypassed the elite preparatory schools and prestigious universities that catered to the already privileged. Instead, Willis directed his vast resources entirely toward the bleakest, most unforgiving districts of the inner city, the exact same brutal concrete landscape where he had forged his own ironclad character decades ago. He established fully funded comprehensive scholarships specifically designed for genuine orphans and fiercely determined youths who possessed absolutely nothing but raw, untested potential. These were children who understood the crushing reality of hunger and abandonment, kids who woke up every single day fighting for basic survival. Willis saw in their hardened, eager eyes the exact same fierce ambition and profound gratitude that his own adopted children had violently rejected. Decades ago, he had plucked Kendall and Jasmine from obscurity, handing them a flawless, luxurious existence on a silver platter, shielding them entirely from the harsh struggles that build genuine resilience. He recognized now that his absolute unyielding protection had been his greatest miscalculation, spoiling their character by removing the necessary friction of genuine hardship. By investing his massive fortune into the city's forgotten youth, Willis found a profound, undeniable sense of true purpose that his corporate conquests had never truly satisfied. He was no longer subsidizing the lavish, hollow lifestyles of parasitic traders. He was actively building concrete futures for brilliant, hungry minds who deeply respected the monumental opportunity they were being given. Every scholarship granted, every tuition check cleared, and every young life transformed served as a quiet, powerful testament to his legacy. He had successfully taken the immense wealth meant to ruin him and utilized it to forge a resilient, highly educated army of legitimate successors who actually deserved to inherit the earth. The crisp golden light of the early morning sun crested over the manicured tree line, casting long, peaceful shadows across the sprawling grounds of the estate. Willis sat quietly in his sturdy wooden porch chair, holding a simple ceramic mug of strong, black coffee. He took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich, bitter warmth ground him in the absolute perfection of the present moment. He looked out over the vast, empty land he had fiercely protected, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of completion. There was absolutely no lingering bitterness poisoning his mind, no residual anger burning in his chest over the family that had tried to bury him. He had executed a silent, flawless correction, meeting their treacherous conspiracy with overwhelming, calculated force. He had not stooped to their pathetic level of frantic scheming or emotional manipulation. Instead, he had utilized his sharp intellect, his unyielding discipline, and his immense resources to orchestrate a masterclass in definitive, undeniable justice. He had completely dismantled the toxic machinery of their greed, permanently neutralizing the lethal threat of the cartel, while simultaneously eradicating the parasites living under his own roof. His towering legacy was entirely secure, fundamentally protected by the philanthropic fortress he had built from the ashes of his corporate empire. Willis rested his hands on the armrests of his chair, listening to the gentle morning breeze rustle through the ancient oak trees bordering his property. He had survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged entirely victorious on his own uncompromising terms. As the sun fully illuminated the quiet estate, Willis smiled, savoring the ultimate hard-won triumph of living the remainder of his days with absolutely unbroken dignity, pristine honor, and total unmitigated freedom. The passage of time solidified Willis's monumental victory, permanently cementing his legacy within the very foundation of the city. He spent his remaining years walking the sunlit gardens of his fortress, completely unburdened by the parasitic demands of his past. The sprawling educational institution he had meticulously built with the remnants of his corporate empire thrived rapidly, transforming the lives of thousands of destitute children who possessed the exact fiery resilience his own adopted heirs had so arrogantly discarded. These brilliant, hungry young minds became his true successors, entirely validating his painful decision to sever the toxic bloodline. Willis no longer looked back at the shattered ruins of his former family with any trace of sorrow or regret. He had successfully orchestrated a flawless, definitive correction against their unyielding greed. The deafening silence that now filled his opulent halls was not a void, but a profound and beautiful testament to his ultimate triumph. He had faced the darkest depths of familial betrayal and emerged entirely victorious, choosing to finish his remarkable journey enveloped in absolute peace, pristine honor, and undeniable freedom. True wealth is never defined by the accumulated assets sitting in a frozen offshore bank account, nor is it measured by the unearned privileges handed to ungrateful beneficiaries. Genuine prosperity is forged through absolute resilience, unshakable boundaries, and the courage to sever toxic ties even when they are bound by blood. This story undeniably proves that walking away from manipulation is the ultimate victory. You possess the definitive power to rewrite your own legacy and protect your peace. If you found the strength in this journey inspiring, subscribe to our channel today and share your own story of triumph below.